Welcome to our YouTube channel. Hi guys, tonight we are stepping straight into a world where the cold does not politely knock at your door, but barges in, slips through every crack in the wall and curls around your bones before you even manage to yawn. Picture yourself in the depths of a medieval winter dawn, barely breaking frost, painting white lace on the edges of your tiny window, and a draft so sharp it feels like a knife dragged across your skin. You pull whatever ragged blanket you can find closer, but it does almost nothing. The truth is, you probably won't survive this night without fire bodies or sheer stubbornness. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And, while you're at it, let me know your location and your local time in the comments. I love imagining where in the world you're listening from. Now dim the lights. Your toes curl against the rough rush matting on the floor. It feels damp, even though it's frozen. That's the nature of medieval mornings: cold that seeps, damp that clings, air so heavy with frost that every breath burns your throat. The sound you hear first is not bird song, but the crack and groan of timber as it contracts under the night's frost. And you, wrapped in a coarse woolen tunic, tug at the edges of a blanket stuffed with straw, hoping some part of your skin can find warmth. Daily life in this era begins and ends with the reality of cold. The mainstream historical fact here is simple. Most people lived in timber or and dorm huts with very little insulation, and the warmth inside rarely rose much above the chill outside. Archaeological studies of early medieval houses in northern Europe show floors of packed earth, thin walls, and wide roof gaps that invited in winter winds, as though the house was daring you to complain. Comfort was a luxury only the rich even pretended to grasp. Still, there were strategies. You notice smoke from a neighbor's hearth curling into the air, the one hopeful sign that fire survived the night. Your own home has no chimney yet. The hearth smolders in the center of the room and smoke hugs the rafters before reluctantly drifting out of a hole in the roof. You cough, your eyes sting, but you welcome that sting, because smoke means the fire hasn't gone out entirely. That smoldering heap of embers buried under yesterday's ash might just be coaxed back to life if you blow gently and feed it. Dry twigs lose it, and you face hours of shivering until you borrow flame from a neighbor. Imagine the stress. Warmth not just as comfort but as survival currency. There's a quirky tidbit that often surprises people: to save embers overnight, some households used clay pots or covered iron vessels, essentially medieval fire safes. The glowing coals would be banked with ash and hidden under lids so they could be revived at dawn. The modern image of people endlessly striking flint in the morning is misleading. Fire was precious, and you guarded it jealously, like a family member. Lose your ember, and you'd be trudging half a mile through snow to beg a coal from someone else, carrying it home in a pot swaddled in wool. Like a baby. As you shuffle toward the hearth, breath visible in the dimness, you think of how historians still argue whether medieval winters were harsher than ours or whether the so-called Little Ice Age exaggerated the misery. Some suggest the coldest centuries came later, in the Renaissance, when even the temples froze solid. But anyone who has ever sat in a stone hut in January would argue that the debate hardly matters. The cold was devastating enough. You poke at the embers, sparks leap, and for a fleeting moment you feel like a magician. That glow is more valuable than gold. A thin curl of warmth licks your fingers. Not enough to thaw, but enough to give hope. Your family stirs, children groaning, an older parent sneezing loudly, and all eyes fix on you. Can you bring the fire back in that small smoky circle? You feel the weight of generations who measured their mornings not in comfort but in whether the ember held outside. Dawn is late and weak. Snow crunches as villages begin to stir. Some carry bundles of sticks on their backs, others stumble toward barns to feed animals that also shiver in their stalls. Frost whitens every thatched roof, turning the whole village into a silent sketch in chalk. You draw your wool tighter, realizing that today, like every day of winter, will be a slow struggle against freezing air. Yet there is also rhythm to this misery, a strange familiarity. You know how to tuck your feet beneath you when you sit, how to cradle hands around a clay cup once porridge is warm, how to angle your body toward the hearth so every inch of smoke, stained heat can kiss your skin. You know that this morning will feel eternal, but eventually the sun will rise higher and the cold will dull into something merely bearable. The smell of smoke fills your lungs again. Acrid yet comforting, you lean in coaxing flame from ember and for the first time today you believe you might last another 24 hours in this frozen world. It is not luxury, it is not comfort, it is simply survival. One ember at a time. The glow builds, licking higher. As the hearth begins to breathe, you shuffle closer, stretching out your hands, but the heat does not spread far. The hearth is not a modern fireplace, but a pit dug into the floor or a crude stone circle. Smoke writhes upward, not neatly but like a restless spirit refusing to leave until it has kissed every beam and blackened every corner of the roof. You blink through tears, eyes watering, lungs roar. Yet you hold your ground because this flicker is not just fire. It is the center of your world. The open hearth is everything at once, kitchen heater and social magnet. You notice how your entire day will circle back to this pit of flame. Here, bread is toasted on iron pokers, stews bubble slowly in hanging cauldrons and children dart too close, risking sined hair as their parents scold and pull them back. In fact, one mainstream historical fact is that medieval households revolved physically and socially around the hearth. It wasn't a decorative feature tucked into a wall. It was planted right in the middle of the room, demanding constant attention. But here's the quirky part. It wasn't just warmth and food. The hearth fire was sometimes seen as spiritually alive. People whispered charms over it, crossed themselves when lighting it, and some even placed protective herbs in the flames. There are recorded traditions where a family would never let the fire die because it was thought to be bad luck or, worse, an omen of death. The fire was a household guardian as much as it was a furnace. Imagine going to bed each night knowing that if you slipped into carelessness and the coals faded, you might have offended not just your family but also some invisible power. And yet historians continue to puzzle over how effective these open hearths really were. Some argue that, despite their central place, they gave off pitiful amounts of heat in the drafty rooms of peasant cottages or noble halls alike. Others counter that the psychological warmth mattered more. The presence of light and glow softened the perception of cold, even when the actual air temperature barely shifted. It's one of those debates where numbers might not fully capture the feeling. You can measure heat output, but you can't measure the comfort of flickering shadows on a winter's night. As you sit by the fire now, your knees prickling with warmth while your back shivers in the draft, you notice how the hearth is also the village's rhythm keeper. A neighbor bursts in stamping snow from her shoes. Holding a pot, she begs a few embers to restart her own fire, and in exchange she promises bread tomorrow. This exchange is not strange, it is daily life. Embers are borrowed like salt and the fire ties the whole community together. The smell of char, the crackle of resin in pine wood, the faint sizzle when damp logs are tossed in, all of it becomes the heartbeat of winter survival. And there is danger too. Sparks jump unexpectedly, landing on your tunic. You slap quickly, heart racing, realizing how easily a moment's distraction could reduce your home to ashes. Medieval villages burned often. One stray ember, one poorly tended flame, and half the settlement could vanish overnight. The open hearth was no tame creature. It was warmth, but also wildness, something you respected and feared in equal measure. You think about how children must have grown up half-trained in fire, watching, learning early to feed it, bank it, and guard it. A household without a vigilant eye was one step closer to disaster, and the smell of smoke in your clothes, your hair, your skin. It never left. You walk through town, and you can tell who has been to the hearth by the faint aura of char that clings to everyone. In a way, it was the perfume of survival. By midday the hearth has settled into its rhythm, not roaring but glowing. Embers banked so they last until evening. The stew simmers, someone lays damp boots by the edge, hoping they'll dry before tomorrow. A dog curls on the floor belly to the heat, sighing deeply as though it alone knows comfort. And you, half smoked and half thawed, realize that this one pit of fire is the thin line between life and death in a winter that offers nothing. Kindly, as shadows flicker up the soot-stained beams, you remember this is just the beginning. The hearth is not a luxury. It is the fragile flicker on which your entire existence balances. Without it, you would not last the week. With it, you can at least sit and pretend for a few hours that warmth is possible in a world built mostly of cold. The air is thick now, not from warmth but from the stubborn haze that refuses to rise. You sit by the open blaze, your eyes watering, your throat coated with soot, and you wonder if breathing in winter might kill you faster than freezing. The hearth roars in its shallow pit, but with no proper chimney. The smoke simply chooses its own path up into the beams curling against the rafters, spreading across the room until you can barely see your own fingers. The sensation is a paradox: you are alive because of this fire, and you are coughing because of it too. The mainstream historical fact is stark. Before chimneys became common in the late medieval period, most homes relied on a simple smoke hole in the roof to guide the haze outside. But this guiding was generous. In reality, smoke drifted wherever it pleased, thickening the air so much that visitors described houses as uninhabitable during cooking. The blackened rafters of medieval cottages and halls bear testimony. Archaeologists find centuries of tar and soot caked onto wood like permanent shadows. Yet there is something oddly practical about this choking atmosphere. A quirky tidbit: smoke, however irritating, helped preserve timbers from insects, acted as a crude disinfectant, and even cured hanging meats that villagers strung from the rafters. You cough and wheeze, but you also nibble on smoked bacon that owes its flavor to this accidental preservation. The air may be unbreathable, but your dinner benefits from the same smoldering cloud. Still, historians debate how people tolerated such an environment. Some argue that medieval folk were simply used to it, their lungs acclimated in ways we cannot imagine. Others suggest that smoky houses were mainly seasonal, with fires blazing at full intensity only during winter months. There is no consensus, though, on whether these homes shortened lifespans significantly. You picture scholars leaning forward over fragile manuscripts, disagreeing about whether the haze was a silent killer or a tolerable nuisance, while you, coughing on the ground in this thought experiment, might like to settle the argument by pointing at your burning eyes. Your nose runs, your head aches. The fire crackles merrily. Utterly indifferent to your discomfort, you crouch lower, angling your body toward what warmth you can catch, even as you choke. The children hide beneath blankets, eyes peeking out like small owls, their hair smelling perpetually of char. When guests arrive, you laugh awkwardly and wave your arms at the smoke, as if shooing away an unwanted cat. The truth is, no medieval dwelling was free of it. Every house, every hall, every kitchen carried the same haze. Sometimes the smoke turns the room into a theater of shadows. Sunlight pierces through the roof hole and beams of light scatter like golden swords in the mirror. Dust does dance with ash flakes, creating a surreal beauty that almost makes you forget the stench. You imagine sitting back, half suffocating, but marveling at the way light plays on the smoke. For a moment it feels like a chapel, with shafts of sun instead of stained glass. But beauty fades when your eyes sting again. You tie a rag over your mouth, something mothers teach children. When the haze grows too cruel, the rag does little, but it gives the illusion of protection. Your skin itches, and when you step outside, the air feels like pure relief, crisp and clean, even though it is freezing. You take deep gulps, lungs burning with cold but grateful for clarity. And yet you always return inside, because outside there is nothing but frost and emptiness, and inside at least, the hearth glows. You sit once more, coughing but also thawing your fingers against the coals. The paradox becomes normal. The smoke becomes a neighbor you never wanted but must live with. Evenings are the worst. The fire is stoked high for cooking, the roof hole too small, the room filled with laughter and hacking coughs in equal measure. Someone sings a song, another ladles stew, a child sneezes, and all of you sit in the dim twilight of survival. You joke about the smoke, even as it makes your voice raspy, and you realize in this medieval winter the choice is not between comfort and discomfort, it is between breathing smoke and not breathing at all. The smoke hangs heavy, but the true warmth doesn't come only from the fire, it comes from the people pressed close together around it, shoulders overlapping, breaths mingling. In the dim haze, you shift on the hard bench, your knees brushing against another, your blanket tugged tighter because half of it has been stolen by a sibling leaning too far into your space. Privacy is a luxury. Survival is a collective contract. The mainstream historical fact is clear. Medieval families, particularly peasants, often slept in a single room, huddled together against the biting cold. Archaeological reconstructions of cottages show not separate bedrooms but one open space, livestock sometimes sharing the same floor for added warmth. The idea of a nuclear family bed is not a modern joke. It was a real defense against winter. And then there's the quirky detail that makes you chuckle, despite the chill. Sometimes entire communities practiced bundling, where travelers or guests would literally be invited to share a bed with strangers just to keep everyone from freezing. Boards or heavy sacks might be placed between bodies for modesty, but the closeness was non-negotiable. You didn't worry about awkward small talk. You worried about waking up alive. But scholars still disagree on the extent of this shared intimacy. Some insist that peasants regularly slept with animals indoors, goats, pigs, even chickens, as a form of natural heating, while others argue that such claims are exaggerated by later writers eager to depict medieval life as dirty and uncivilized. The truth may be muddled somewhere in between, and you, lying here with a calf chewing cud just a few feet away, might sigh that the academic debate is missing the point. The beast's warmth is undeniable, whether it's dignified. Your body sinks lower into the pile of coarse wool, strawed mattress, scratching at your legs. You feel the heat radiating from another's back against yours. It's not comfortable. Someone snores loudly, another kicks in their sleep, but you can't deny the way. The cold seems less cruel when shared. The air smells of sweat, smoke and damp wool. But it is familiar, even reassuring. There is a rhythm to this communal survival. At dusk everyone piles in, the youngest tucked deepest into the nest of blankets, the eldest near the fire for easy attending. In the middle of the night someone stirs to add fuel to the embers, muttering curses at the cold, then slides back under the shed covering. You wake momentarily disoriented, then drift off again to the sound of steady breathing, the low murmur of animals shifting nearby and the faint hiss of fire settling deeper into ash. The thought crosses your mind, what happens when sickness strikes? You sneeze once, twice, and you imagine the contagion racing through the whole family bed by morning. Medieval people accepted this risk. The cold was a more immediate threat than disease at the moment. So you turn your face into a wool sleeve and hope your cough is ignored. Yet there is tenderness in this closeness too. Children press their hands into their mother's sides, fathers curl protectively around infants, siblings share whispered jokes long after the room has darkened. Warmth binds you not only in temperature but in affection. Without fire, without insulation, without central heating, the human body itself becomes the last furnace you can trust. You think back to last night when the fire nearly died, and it was only the layered bodies that kept the frost from biting too deep. The memory sends a shiver through you now, not of cold but of gratitude. The house may be filled with smoke, the walls may leak drafts like saves, but as long as bodies huddle together, you stand a chance against the longest nights. Somewhere in the darkness, a dog shifts, sighing, pushing its nose under a blanket edge. You smile at the absurdity of sharing not just warmth but dreams with animals, children and adults all tangled into one bundle. You close your eyes, knowing this arrangement isn't about comfort. It's about survival, plain and simple. And survival in a medieval winter is a victory worth every cramped, smoky, sweaty inch. You wake with straw clinging to your hair and a draft crawling over your skin thin as a knife edge. The fire has gutted down again, little more than grey ash with a dull red core. The room is hushed, your breath curling into pale ribbons that hang for a second before fading into the smoky gloom. You glance around your cottage, and it is painfully clear the walls are no fortress. A mainstream historical fact sets the scene. Most peasant cottages of the medieval period were built from wee and dorm. Thin wooden frames woven with sticks, plastered with a mixture of mud, clay and sometimes cow dung. The roof was thatched, the floor nothing but tamped earth. Archaeologists studying preserved examples in Britain and Northern Europe note how fragile these structures really were, often lasting only a few decades before crumbling. Against summer rain they worked well enough. Against winter winds they were little better than a she. You shift closer to the wall and feel it. Damp seeps through, a clammy chill radiating as though the night itself is pressing its fingers against you. You run your hand across the plaster, and it crumbles slightly, smelling faintly of earth and rot. There is insulation here, but only the most basic sort, layers of dung mixed into the dorm, serving as a crude filler to keep drafts at bay. It works to a point. The quirky tidbit. People often smeared fresh dung along the wall seams each autumn, a seasonal maintenance task, not unlike us fixing, weather stripping. Imagine your household chore list reading: mend roof patch, wall smear dung. Children were sometimes set to this job. Tiny hands pressing handfuls of the smelly paste into cracks. It wasn't glamorous. But in a world without fiberglass or double glazing, cow dung was the medieval Home Depot. Yet scholars remain divided about just how miserable these cottages were in the coldest months. Some suggest that the sheer number of people packed inside, often entire families with livestock, created enough body heat to keep the worst frost away. Others argue that even with dung walls and smoke, interior temperatures hovered just above freezing, leaving inhabitants permanently chilled. The truth, as usual, may lie in the middle, warm enough to survive, too cold to ever feel comfortable. You shuffle toward the embers, coughing as ash rises. The walls creak with the wind, and through the thatch above, snowflakes sometimes drift down like unwanted visitors. You brush one from your blanket, half amused, half despairing. Outside, the fields lie silent under frost, and inside your cottage feels less like shelter and more like a leaky box, barely holding back the sky. Still, you make. Do you? Patch holes with rags, hang old cloaks over gaps and stuff straw between wall and roof. It's never perfect, but it takes the edge off. Sometimes families even plastered animal hides across the coldest side of the house, turning skins into makeshift windbreaks. The smell lingered, yes, but so did a little more warmth as the day begins. You notice the patterns carved into your daily rhythm by these walls. You work harder near the hearth, linger longer in bed, and avoid corners where the frost creeps in. The room is not evenly warm. It has microclimates, hot by the fire, icy at the walls, tolerable in the middle. You adapt instinctively, your body learning where to sit, where to sleep, where to avoid the sound of dripping starts. As a patch of snow melts through the thatch, you mutter and place a pot beneath it, realizing that your cottage is always engaged in a constant argument with the elements. And though the elements usually win, you keep patching, mending, and surviving. When you finally step outside into the snow, you almost laugh. The cottage looks like it belongs, its thatched roof, white as the ground, its walls blending with the earth. It is flimsy, yes, but it is also part of the landscape, home, shaped from mud and dung, fragile yet stubborn. You know you will curse its drafts tonight, but for now you nod at it with a grudging respect. After all, it still stands, and so do you. The wind howls across the open fields, rattling shutters. But when you step into the nobleman's hall, you are struck first not by silence or grandeur, but by size. The ceiling soars high above you, beams blackened with soot, banners stirring faintly in the draught. At the center, a fire roars with a confidence no peasant could dream of. Logs thick as your arm piled one upon another. Flames leap toward the rafters, sparks snapping like restless insects. For a moment it feels like stepping into another world. But the truth reveals itself quickly enough. The mainstream historical fact is simple. The medieval Great Hall, the heart of a lord's household, was built for gathering, feasting and asserting authority. The hearth was often enormous, placed centrally on the floor or later shifted toward a wall with a hood to guide the smoke. These fires consumed staggering amounts of wood each day, sometimes entire cart loads, reflecting both wealth and the sheer impracticality of heating such cavernous spaces. Records show noble households employing whole teams of servants tasked with cutting, hauling, and feeding the fire continuously. But here comes the quirky tidbit. Despite its size, the fire barely warmed the hall. Visitors often complained that they roasted on the side facing the flames while their backs froze solid. The nobility sat on raised platforms at one end, closer to the blaze, while servants and guests shivered further down the room. The illusion of warmth mattered more than its reality. A roaring fire made a statement. Here lives someone powerful enough to burn a forest in one winter. Historians still debate whether these great halls were primarily functional heating systems or symbolic displays of wealth and dominance. Some argue that they were simply impractical as living spaces in winter better suited to ceremonies and banquets than daily comfort. Others counter that the social warmth, music, company feasts, offset the chill, making the hall livable in its own way. Standing here with your cheeks scorched and your spine cold, you suspect the argument is not academic at all, but entirely physical. You shuffle closer, edging into the ring of heat, while behind you the hall echoes with coughs and mutters. Servants scurry past carrying wood, their faces red from smoke, their eyes narrowed against drifting sparks. Dogs sprawl near the edge of the hearth, clever enough to claim the best spot somewhere above. Smoke swirls into the rafters before slinking lazily toward roof vents, but most of it still hangs thick, leaving your cloak reeking before long. The sound of the fire fills the hall, a constant crackling undertone beneath conversations. You imagine the lord at his table, bathed in flickering orange, his goblet gleaming as he gestures grandly. Behind him, tapestries flutter in the draught, their scenes of hunting and battle. More decorative than insulating, though, they do dull the worst chill from the stone. The servants bring trenches of steaming meat, the smell mingling with wood smoke, until hunger overtakes discomfort. Still, you can't ignore the contradiction. This is grandeur at its most impractical. The blaze devours wood with greedy appetite, yet the hall remains cold. Guests tug cloaks tighter, shift their chairs closer or hover near the flames when no one important is watching. The poor outside might dream of such a fire, but the reality is far less comfortable than it seems. You watch as the logs collapse, inward sparks shooting high. A boy darts forward with a fresh armload, nearly tumbling into the pit as he feeds the blaze. He grins despite the danger for a servant. Warmth is fleeting, so you enjoy it while you can. The hall hums with life, but the cold seeps back quickly into corners and shadows, always reminding you that stone, no matter how richly decorated, is a poor companion in winter. As the night deepens, music begins, the hall alive with laughter, ale and song. Yet even here, noblemen pull their cloaks tighter, shifting closer to the hearth. The fire roars, the smoke curls, the banners stir, and still you shiver. Wealth may buy spectacle, but it does not always buy comfort. The banners in the noble hall sway slightly as the fire spits, but your eyes are drawn to the walls themselves, stretching upward. Vast stone surfaces catch the glow of flames, yet seem to swallow it whole, leaving corners dim and cold. A chill seeps from those stones, as if they hoarded the winter inside their bulk. You tug your cloak tighter and then notice something remarkable: hangings of fabric, long swaths of woven threads depicting hunts, saints and floral patterns. They ripple faintly in the draught, but they change the atmosphere in a way bare stone never could. One well-documented reality of this era is that nobles invested heavily in tapestries and other textile wall hangings, not only as a show of wealth but as insulation. Contemporary records describe how these fabrics were hung across stone surfaces to reduce the biting chill. They acted like medieval wallpaper, portable, colorful and surprisingly practical. When nobles traveled between castles, tapestries went with them, rolled carefully and loaded into wagons so that no hall was left cold and barren for long. Oddly enough, these textiles sometimes carried more than warmth. Imagine a tapestry serving as both insulation and storytelling device, a vast woven canvas showing family genealogy, religious imagery, or even political propaganda. Guests would sit and stare not just at flickering fire light but at a visual reminder of their host's power. And here's a curious little twist: there are accounts of some noble households hanging entire painted cloths smeared with wax to repel dampness, turning the walls into a patchwork of protection and prestige. Yet experts remain divided on just how effective these wall hangings were against the cold. Some argue that the thickest wool or linen, even with padded backings, could not do much more than dull the worst drafts seeping through stone. Others insist that in a time when any layer mattered, the psychological comfort of a decorated and slightly less icy wall was worth every coin. The disagreement continues because physical evidence, fragments of cloth, records of inventories, gives us hints but not the full sensory reality of sitting in a castle during January. You walk closer, fingertips brushing the edge of one hanging. The surface is rough threads, slightly greasy from linoline, the smell faintly earthy. You imagine how servants climbed ladders to fix these panels in place, how they shook them out in summer and beat the dust from them in autumn, preparing for another cycle of winter defense. They are both ornament and armor, softening a hall otherwise echoing with stone and smoke. The hall feels transformed where the fabric hangs; instead of a cavern it becomes a chamber. Shadows are warmer, colors glow in firelight and the damp stone no longer chills quite as sharply. A dog shifts closer to the wall, curling happily where the draft has been dulled. You realize that warmth in the medieval world was never a single trick. It was layering fire, bodies, fabrics, stones, all working together, imperfectly but persistently. The servants bustle in adjusting a hanging that has sagged. You picture the labor behind it, the spinners, weavers, dyers, all creating this single piece. Every thread was touched by hand, every pattern intentional, in a world where nothing came cheap. A tapestry was not just decoration, it was survival art. Families might sit with their backs to it at night, letting its fibers absorb some of the room's chill, never mind the noble symbolism stitched across its face. You move to a corner without a hanging and the difference is instant. The stone radiates cold like a block of ice, your skin prickles, breath condenses in quick fog, and you find yourself instinctively stepping back toward the warmth of fabric. It dawns on you that medieval people understood this intimately, not as theory, but as daily truth. You don't need to measure insulation value in numbers, you simply feel it in your bones. Of course, hangings could only do so much. In a deep frost, the hall still felt cavernous, drafts slipped beneath doorways and warmth pulled only within reach of the hearth. But think about how human imagination fills gaps, how a richly colored wall transforms your sense of space. You are not only less cold, you believe yourself less cold. That belief alone might keep you going through the bitter months. Later, in the evening, guests arrive for a feast. They stare at the gleaming hangings, remark on their beauty and whisper about the cost. The host smiles knowing he has impressed them not just with fire and food, but with walls that tell stories, walls that keep out more than frost. They keep out the impression of poverty. You sit back and consider how warmth in this world is never simply physical. It is also symbolic, psychological, social. To hang a tapestry is to show that you care about comfort, culture and status all at once. The cold is relentless, but so is the human instinct to fight it with beauty as well as practicality. As the night wanes, you lean against the fabric, your head resting where a deer is woven. In mid-leap, the fire snaps, the hall buzzes, and for once you don't feel the stone snoring at your spine. Instead, you feel cocooned in color, sound, and warmth. A fragile victory, but a victory nonetheless, stitched carefully into woolen threads that will outlast the winter. The hall slowly quiets, the fire collapses into glowing coals, and yet the cold creeps in again, searching for weaknesses. Your gaze drifts upward toward the windows, those dark holes in the wall that seem more like invitations for frost than barriers against it. You wrap your arms tighter, knowing instinctively that medieval windows were rarely allies in the battle against winter. One well-preserved fact from this period is that most windows in peasant homes were little more than unglazed openings, sometimes covered with wooden shutters, sometimes patched with cloth or thin leather. In wealthier households, oiled parchment was stretched across wooden frames to admit a muted glow while blocking some drafts. Glass existed, yes, but it was staggeringly expensive, reserved for churches, monasteries, and the most opulent castles. Even then, it was often wavy, bubbled and pieced together in small panels held by lead canes rather than the clear panes you know today. Here's a curious little twist: even when a lord could afford glass, he often chose colored pieces for their beauty. Imagine trying to enjoy what little winter sunlight there was through a window that glowed green or amber. Pretty but hardly practical. The glass dazzled visitors but left the inhabitants squinting in dim light and still shivering against drafts seeping around. The lead wealth once again made a statement, but not necessarily warmth. Researchers remain divided over just how much protection parchment or horn windows offered. Some argue that the thin materials filtered only the light and did little against the cold. Others counter that even the faintest barrier slowed the biting winds enough to matter. The evidence is tricky. Few medieval homes survive intact, and documents often focus more on taxes and property rights than on daily window coverings. Standing here, your fingers numbed by the draft, you're inclined to side with the skeptics. Parchment might mute the gale, but it doesn't stop you from shivering. You step closer, pushing against a shutter. It cars and rattles. Its surface rough with age, and a blast of icy air rushes through the gap. You slam it back, heart thumping. The shutter doesn't seal it. Never does cold fingers reach through cracks, reminding you that winter doesn't need an invitation. It seeps in wherever it finds space. You stuff a rag into the joint, hoping for a reprieve, but deep down you know it's a losing battle. Daylight through these openings is weak and filtered more gloom than glow. You imagine waking each morning to a room dim enough to mistake for twilight, squinting as you poke the hearth awake, stumbling as you grope for tools. Sunlight never floods the space. It dribbles in, reluctantly bouncing off smoke and soot until the interior feels more like a cave than a chamber. And when night falls, shutters slam shut, leaving you entirely at the mercy of firelight and rush lamps. Yet there's resilience. Here too, families learn tricks. Some draped spare cloth or even old cloaks across windows, layering protection. Others angled shutters inward, adding thickness, or plastered edges with clay for the season. In towns, people leaned against the walls of neighbors' houses, stacking their homes close, so fewer sides were exposed to the wind. Every adjustment mattered, however small. The sound of the wind outside grows louder, rattling through gaps like an uninvited guest. You imagine the snow piling against the outer wall, drifting against the shutters, frosting their edges. You touch the surface and feel it icy, a reminder that you live not behind walls and glass but in constant negotiation with the elements. Survival here is improvisation. And there's something oddly beautiful too. On bright mornings, sunlight catches the oiled parchment, making it glow like amber. You squint and see shadows of passing figures outside, villages bent beneath loads of wood, children trailing behind, dogs bounding in snow. The window is imperfect, but it is a lens to the world, a reminder that even in the depths of winter, life continues just beyond the walls. By evening, though you curse it again, drafts snake across the floor, extinguishing candles, chilling bare toes. You pull closer to the fire, muttering about shutters that will never stay shut, and you wonder whether comfort is even possible in such a house. But then you remind yourself. People endured this not for days, but for generations. They patched, layered and adapted, not because they had perfect solutions, but because imperfect ones were all they needed to survive. The window rattles once more, a groaning hinge echoing in the dimness. You sigh and smile faintly. This is the sound of winter, a song sung not by snow or frost, but by wood, cloth and parchment fighting to hold back the night. And you, sitting in your cloak by the fire, are part of that same battle. One more figure hunched against a draft that never quite ends. The window rattles again, but you turn away because the true refuge of winter waits in the corner of the room, the bed. Not a single soft mattress with springs and sheets, the way you might imagine, but a makeshift nest. Straw stuffed into a sack, layered with linen, wool and whatever scraps of fur you can gather. It doesn't look like much, yet once you crawl inside you realize. This bundle of fabric and straw is meant to function like a miniature furnace, trapping every bit of heat your body produces. Contemporary accounts confirm that bedding was the medieval person's most reliable shield against cold nights. The poor made do with straw pallets, often shared by several members of a household. The wealthier layered feather beds, coverlets and fur throws, until the sleeper was buried under a small mountain of textiles. Archaeological finds even suggest beds were sometimes boxed in with wood panels or curtains, creating a pocket of warmth where breath hung heavy, but frost dared not settle. Oddly enough, one of the more eccentric customs was the use of hay or even dried seaweed as mattress filler. In coastal villages, people stuffed whatever they had on hand into sacks, replacing the contents periodically when they became too musty. The bed wasn't meant to be plush, it was meant to insulate. Imagine curling up on a crinkling mattress of dried reeds. Less cozy cloud, more rustling nest. Yet in the dead of winter, the sound was reassuring proof that you had something between you and the frozen floor. Specialists continue to puzzle over how much privacy or comfort these sleeping arrangements allowed. Some argue that the heavy bed curtains found in wealthier homes were as much about warmth as they were about intimacy. Others suggest they doubled as status symbols, embroidered and dyed to show wealth in a world where fabric was more precious than coin. Still, whether for warmth, privacy, or bragging rights, the enclosed bed became one of the defining features of medieval domestic life. You climb into the bedding now feeling the scratch of straw beneath the first layer of wool. It pricks at your skin through thin linen. But once you shift around, the straw compresses, molding slightly to your shape. The blanket above is heavy, pressing down with reassuring weight. You tuck the edges beneath your body, sealing yourself into a cocoon. Within minutes, the warmth of your own breath builds into a pocket of livable air. It is dark inside the bed curtains, the firelight reduced to a faint glow. Through the fabric, you hear the sounds of the house settling, wood creaking, the dog shifting on the floor, the faint whistle of wind sneaking through shutters. But in here, within this nest, the world feels muted. Even the bitter drafts seem to hesitate, defeated by layers of wool, fur and tightly drawn cloth. There are risks, of course. A coal or ember slipping too near could set bedding ablaze in an instant. Stories circulated of careless sleepers waking to smoldering straw, scrambling to beat out sparks before they spread. The smell of smoke might mean warmth in the hall, but in the bed it meant terror. Parents warn children never to drag embers too close. Though sometimes desperate for warmth, someone risked it anyway. Yet, despite these dangers, the bed was where families found not just warmth but comfort. Children nestled against parents, siblings shared furs, couples whispered quietly in the darkness. The intimacy was forced by necessity, but it also forged bonds. You imagine lying here shoulder to shoulder, your breath mingling with others, the bed curtains holding back not only drafts but also the loneliness of a long night. And when you finally close your eyes, the effect is magical. The world outside the bed may be frozen solid, but inside your little furnace of fabric, time softens. Dreams float easily in this cocoon. Perhaps that's why medieval people so often describe sleep as blessed, even sacred. It was the one time the cold could not chase you, the one time your body truly rested. Morning will come with stiff joints and straw stuck to your hair. You'll sneeze at the dust, shake out the covers and groan at the cold that floods in once you leave. But tonight at least you understand how a sack of straw and a pile of blankets could become the single most treasured technology of winter survival. The straw beneath you still rustles when you rise and your joints ache with the stiffness of sleeping in one position too long. The fire has burned low again, nothing but gray ash veiling a faint glow. You grope for something to bring comfort before you dare face the chill of the room. And then you remember the household trick passed down for generations: hot stones and warming pans. Evidence from medieval household records makes it clear that people often relied on heated objects to carry warmth into their beds. Smooth stones were baked in the embers or near the hearth until they radiated heat, then wrapped in cloth to prevent burns before being slipped between covers. In wealthier homes, metal warming pans filled with coals were slid under blankets, moved back and forth like a slow iron to chase away the damp chill. They did not last long, but for those first few moments as you climbed into bed, the relief was heavenly. Surprisingly, some households went further with this practice. There are accounts of bricks, tiles and even iron tools being heated for use as makeshift warmers. Farmers occasionally place small pots of embers near their feet, relying on their glow to carry them into sleep. In colder regions, it was not unusual to find families keeping warmed stones wrapped all night, pulling them into the bed as if they were pets. Imagine hugging a carefully bundled rock, grateful not for its companionship but for the lingering heat it stubbornly held. Not all scholars agree on how widespread warming pans were outside noble homes. Some argue that the metal required to craft them was too costly for peasants, who likely stuck to stones and tiles. Others suggest that simpler wooden-handled pans filled with hot sand might have been accessible to the better-off among villagers. The lack of consistent archaeological evidence keeps the debate alive, though it hardly matters. When you place a hot stone at your feet and sigh in delight, you reach toward the hearth now carefully fishing a flat stone from the ashes. It's glowing faintly at the edges, too hot to touch. You wrap it quickly in cloth and cradle it gingerly, the warmth seeping into your stiff fingers. For a moment, you close your eyes and imagine that this one rock is a sun, small but powerful, offering just enough heat to keep the frost at bay. You tuck it into the bedding and watch steam rise faintly from the cloth as the chill flees. The air smells of scorched fabric, sharp and acrid. You grimace, knowing the danger: too hot and the stone might singe or even ignite the bedding. Families learned caution early. Children were warned not to touch the pan when it slid beneath the sheets, lest their hands blister instantly. Stories circulated of careless servants who left coals too long and woke to find smoldering mattresses. In winter, fire was both savior and threat, and nowhere was that balance more intimate than in your own bed. As the stone cools, you curl your toes around it, savoring the fading warmth. The sensation spreads through your legs like a memory of summer. You know it will not last. Within an hour the stone will be cold again, indistinguishable from the floor. But that brief reprieve is enough to soothe you into sleep, enough to ease the ache of endless drafts. You think of how many nights in history were softened by such little tricks. How many people whispered thanks to a stone, a tile, a pan of coals. How many nights might have been unbearable without this small clever invention. It is humbling in a way to realize that survival sometimes depends not on grand feasts or mighty castles, but on a rock, pulled from the fire and swaddled like a child. The fire sputters again, embers sighing, and you know, another stone could be heated soon. Tonight you will sleep, not in comfort but in a compromise, shivering less because you've carried a fragment of the hearth with you into the dark. And when dawn arrives, cold and pale, you will rise with stiff limbs, shake out the bedding and prepare once more for the nightly ritual of coaxing warmth into the bed. It is a fragile routine, but it works. The winter outside rages on uncaring, but inside your little corner, a stone, a cloth, and a bit of ingenuity mean the difference between despair and endurance. The glow of your stone fades into darkness, leaving you once more at the mercy of the hearth. The fire, though essential, was never the only flame in a medieval household. You notice the small flickers scattered across the room, candles set into wooden holders, rush lights leaning in clay pots, stubby tapers dripping wax onto the floor. Their glow is frail compared to the roaring hearth, but when the fire dies low, these lesser flames take on a dignity of their own. It's well documented in household accounts that medieval lighting came from three main sources: candles, rushlights and oil lamps. Candles made from tallow or beeswax doubled as heat givers in tiny spaces, though their warmth was weak at best. Beeswax was prized, burning bright with less smoke, but far too costly for peasants. Most villagers relied on tallow candles, made from rendered animal fat, which sputtered, smoked and left the house smelling faintly rancid. Still, in a world of deep winter darkness, even the stink of tallow was worth the light. Here's an eccentric detail: rush lights were among the most common household inventions. Villagers soaked the pith of rush plants in animal fat and set them all light, creating long, thin tapers that burned unevenly. They were cheap, accessible, and practical, but they dripped ash everywhere and filled the air with a sour, greasy scent. Some households grew rushes specifically for this purpose, harvesting and drying them in autumn to prepare for the dark months. Imagine the sound of them crackling faintly, their glow jittering like nervous fireflies in the gloom. Not all historians agree on how much heat these small lights actually contributed. Some suggest they added negligible warmth, useful only for visibility. Others counter that in tightly enclosed corners, say within bed curtains or tiny nooks, these flames offered enough heat to take the sting off frost. The lack of precise measurements leaves the debate unresolved, but anyone who has cupped frozen hands around a candle knows the comfort of even the smallest flame. You reach for one now, pinching the base to adjust it upright. The fat sputters sending a smoky curl into the air, and your fingers smell faintly of grease. The light is dim, but you lean closer, grateful for the tiny circle of glow it throws across the table. For a moment you can see clearly enough to mend a sock, scratch a note, or simply watch shadows dance. The flame pops suddenly, making you flinch, proof that even this humble source of light and warmth has its own little temper. These flames were fragile companions. One gust of draft, one careless elbow, and they winked out, plunging the room into darkness. Children learned quickly to shield them with their bodies when doors opened, crouching like guardians around fragile stars. A candle wasn't just convenience, it was responsibility. You feel that weight now as you shield the rush light with your palm, watching the shadows grow long on the wall. And yet, for all their weakness, these lights changed the atmosphere completely. The room seems less empty, with their flicker less hostile. The cold remains, yes, creeping at your feet, but your eyes rest easier when the darkness is not absolute. Medieval nights were long, far longer than you may imagine, stretching endlessly from afternoon dusk to late morning light. Without these flames the nights would feel unbearable. With them, they became survivable, even sometimes beautiful. There is a soft romance in the way the flames dance together. The hearth glows low but the candles wink, the rush lights flicker and the shadows ripple across woven hangings. You hear a child murmur in sleep, shifting beneath blankets, their face bathed faintly in the glow. You imagine couples whispering by candlelight, monks copying texts by rush light, guards warming their hands over a lantern in the night. Watch, the flame is not just heat or light, it is companionship against the vast cold. Of course, danger was always nearby. A tallow candle toppled too close to thatch could mean disaster. Fire was both savior and predator, always waiting to slip out of control. You picture a village night when one careless rush light spilled into straw and an entire row of cottages vanished in smoke. Every flame, no matter how small, was treated with awe and suspicion. You cradle it, but you also fear it, knowing it holds both hope and ruin in equal measure. Still, you blow gently across your candle, not to extinguish it but to watch it bend and flare. The warmth is faint, barely perceptible, but in this dark, frozen room even that whisper of heat feels like a friend's hand on your shoulder, and you realize. Medieval life was built on the cumulative courage of these small flames, each one too weak alone, but together they formed a constellation of survival. In the endless night, the little flames sputter their grease, fading until once again the hearth becomes your main companion. But not every medieval winter night was spent in a smoky cottage or drafty hall. Picture yourself walking in silence through cloistered stone corridors, sandals scraping against frozen flagstones, breath curling like incense in the half-dark. You are in a monastery now where warmth is rationed almost like a sacrament. Documents from monastic rules, especially those of the Benedictines, make clear that fire was not for every room. Monks rose long before dawn, filing into icy chapels to chant prayers with their hands tucked into sleeves. The closer corridors were deliberately unheated, designed to harden the spirit against bodily weakness. Only the kitchen, the infirmary, and sometimes the refectory had dependable fire, leaving monks to endure the cold in silence. Accounts from medieval visitors describe seeing monks' ink freezing in their inkwells and their breath hanging over manuscripts as they copied by hand. Here's a surprising glimpse into that world. In some monasteries, the communal warming room called the factory became a treasured refuge. It was often the only place with a steady blaze, and monks were permitted to gather there for moments of relief. Imagine 20 men shivering in their habits, crowding close to the fire, hands outstretched, trying to absorb enough heat to carry back into the frozen silence of their cells. In some regions, these factories became social hubs where whispered conversations and shared stories shored more than just limbs. There's still disagreement among scholars over how strictly such rules were enforced. Some argue that ascetic orders genuinely forbade fire in dormitories, forcing monks to survive nights in unheated stone cells. Others suggest that local practices varied widely, with pragmatic abbot permitting blazers during especially harsh winters. The written rules might have been stern, but human survival instincts often bent them. We may never know the full consistency of practice, though, standing here your bare feet numb against icy floors, you suspect the stricter interpretations were very real indeed. You follow the line of monks now into the refectory. The hall is austere, but at its center a fire burns. Modest but steady, the smell of smoke mingles with the scent of bread and pottage. The monks eat in silence while a reader chants scripture, bowls steaming faintly in the chill. The fire does not warm the whole room, but its presence makes the meal tolerable. Without it the act of eating would feel like punishment. With it there is a fragile sense of community sustained through the worst months. Later you wander into the scriptorium where scribes sit hunched at long desks. There is no hearth here, only a few candles sputtering against the gloom. The men bend low over pages, their fingers stiff, their ink sluggish. Some wear fingerless gloves, others simply breathe on their hands before continuing. The air is filled with the sound of quills scratching on parchment, a rhythm steady despite the cold. The manuscripts that survive from this era are testaments not just to patience but to endurance, words and illuminations carved into parchment by men half frozen at their desks in the cloister walkways. Frost creeps across the stones, glittering faintly in torchlight. The arches are open to the elements, the wind sweeping through without mercy. You pull your habit tighter, shoulders hunched, and wonder how many winters a man could withstand in this way. Yet for the monks, the cold was more than a challenge. It was a discipline to endure. It was to share in Christ's suffering, to let the body weaken, so the spirit could grow strong still. You can't help but smile at the thought of monks sneaking extra moments in the factory, warming, numb hands before the bells summoned them away. You picture the quiet relief on their faces, the subtle sighs of pleasure as blood returned to their fingers. These small stolen comforts were as human as the prayers they recited. Night falls and the dormitory is black and silent. Rows of narrow beds stretch into the shadows. No fire, no candle, only breath rising like pale mist. You climb under thin blankets, feeling the stones, chill, seep upward through the surrounding mattress. Men shift in silence, coughs echoing against the walls. The discipline is harsh, but there is also a strange serenity, an acceptance of winter as part of spiritual life. Your body shivers, your teeth chatter, but your heart beats steadily. You realize that warmth here is not measured by temperature alone. It is found in the rhythm of prayer, the fellowship of voices chanting in the cold, the shared conviction that enduring hardship brings meaning. For the monks, survival was never the only goal. To shiver was to serve, to suffer was to sanctify. And so in this monastery, cloaked in frost, you drift into uneasy sleep, not warmed by fire but by faith and the quiet strength of men who believed that the cold itself was a teacher. The monastery bells still echo faintly in your ears as you step back into village life, where not every place was resigned to icy silence. Picture the steam rising in thick, fragrant curls, swirling against rafters until the whole room glowed like a ghost. You are standing in a bathhouse, a rare but cherished escape from the endless freeze. Written accounts from medieval towns and cities confirm that public bathos dotted Europe, from bustling London to small German villages. They were more than places to wash. They were warm sanctuaries. The baths were heated by furnaces or large hearths, and the water retained enough heat to fill the air with steam. Patrons lingered soaking in tubs, gossiping, sometimes even eating and drinking, while the snow piled outside. For people accustomed to smoky cottages and freezing halls, these steamy rooms must have felt like stepping into paradise. An unusual detail comes from records in Paris and Nuremberg. Bathos often doubled as taverns or even social clubs. You might sip spiced wine while reclining in hot water or pay extra for food served to you in the tub. Some reports describe musicians hired to play while others relaxed, the notes echoing through clouds of mist. Imagine laughing with neighbors' cheeks flushed from heat, while the city beyond your door groaned under frost. Academic voices still wrestle with how common these establishments truly were. Some historians argue they were widespread and affordable, accessible to artisans and merchants as well as nobles. Others point out that many bathos disappeared by the late Middle Ages, in part due to fears of disease and moral suspicion. The truth, as with much of daily life, likely varied by region, thriving in one town, fading in another. You might never know how accessible they were. But as you sink into warm water, here you don't care about scholarly disputes, you care about how your fingers finally thaw. You lower yourself further, the water biting hot at first, before your body melts into it. The sensation is overwhelming. After weeks of icy drafts, to feel heat around every inch of you is almost shocking. Your skin prickles, sweat beads on your forehead and your muscles are not in gratitude. The air smells of damp wood, of herbs tossed into the water for fragrance, rosemary, thyme, maybe even lavender, if the owner is generous. Around you, people murmur in low voices, steam clouding their faces into shadows. Some lean back, eyes closed, drifting near sleep. Others chatter animatedly, relieved to speak without shivering. The bathhouse becomes a microcosm of comfort, a fragile bubble of warmth holding back the winter. You realize why these places were beloved. Here, for an hour or two, you could forget the cruelty of the season. Of course, such comfort carried risks. Fires roared beneath the water vats and an accident could scald or burn. Too much heat might leave you dizzy, vulnerable to chills. When you stepped outside and rumors swirled about bathhouses being dens of vice, leading to laws that closed many down in later centuries. But at this moment, sitting in fragrant steam, the dangers feel remote. You simply close your eyes and listen to the splash of water, the crackle of fire, the low hum of voices softened by mist. When you finally emerge, your body glows, the cold air outside slaps your skin, but you laugh instead of groan. For a while, your inner warmth shields you, a memory of fire carried in your very blood. By the time you return home, the chill will settle again, the drafts will return, but the bathhouse has given you something rare, a taste of true comfort in a season that usually offers none. You tuck the experience away like a secret ember in your mind. Tomorrow you will wake to frost and smoke, to aching joints and icy breath, but tonight you drift into sleep still wrapped in phantom steam. The warmth of the bathhouse lingers in your memory, but back in the drafty rhythm of everyday life, comfort must often be coaxed from smaller contraptions. You glance across a dimly lit chamber and notice a curious object, a shallow metal pan with holes in the lid. Perched on legs or sometimes carried by a handle, it glows faintly red from the embers within, radiating a fragile heat into the smoky air. You've met the brazier, the portable firebox of the medieval world. Contemporary inventories and household accounts make it plain that blazers were a favored solution in both urban homes and wealthier rural households, filled with charcoal or hot coals. Scooped from the main hearth, they could be moved into smaller rooms, offering a pocket of warmth where the central fire could not reach. Servants carried them into bed chambers, guild members clustered around them in meeting halls, and officials kept them smoldering in drafty council chambers. And here's a curious little practice. In some Mediterranean towns, especially in Spain and Italy, families placed a brazier under a wooden table draped with heavy cloth. People sat around it with the fabric tucked into their laps, effectively creating a heated tent. This contraption, known later as the fraser or status in other cultural parallels, turned mealtime into a cozy refuge. Imagine the delight of slipping your frozen feet under the cloth to find a pocket of trapped heat waiting to greet you. Experts continue to debate the safety and practicality of blazers. On the one hand, they were ingenious, cheap, portable, and effective. On the other, the danger of suffocation from carbon monoxide was very real. Written accounts survive of entire families found dead after leaving a brazier smoldering overnight in a sealed room. Some argue these tragedies were rare but sensationalized. Others maintain that the risk was constant and widely feared. What is certain is that the brazier was both friend and potential executioner, welcomed with gratitude but treated with suspicion. You watch now as a servant shuffles past carrying one. The coals within glowing faintly, ash spilling like gray snowflakes. With each step the smell is sharp, metallic, tinged with smoke. He sets it down near a cluster of people, and immediately they lean in, stretching out hands, sighing at the relief. The glow illuminates their faces, eyes closing briefly, as if they've just remembered what warmth feels like. You edge closer too, letting the heat brush your skin. It's not much more like the ghost of summer than summer itself, but it takes the sting out of the air. Your shins tingle, your fingers relax, and for the first time that day, you uncurl your shoulders. The brazier becomes a little hearth of its own, a center of gravity that draws people together around it. Conversation begins, laughter stirs, even arguments seem easier to handle when you're not frozen stiff. But comfort has its limits. The further you sit, the more quickly the cold regains control. The heat is local, not universal, and as soon as the embers dim, the illusion collapses. You watch the servant return with tongs, shaking the coals, blowing gently until they flare again. Everyone waits hunched and hopeful for that brief renewal. It is easy to see why blazers became symbols of both ingenuity and anxiety. They solved the problem elegantly: how to heat large stone buildings with limited fuel, but they never solved it entirely. You could not walk away from them without risk. You could not sleep safely beside them. Furthermore, you had to live in conversation with their hazards, balancing gratitude and fear. With every glow the night deepens and the brazier still smolders its little heart of fire, holding back the cold as long as it can. You lean closer, feeling its breath against your skin, and you think, warmth in this world is always partial, always temporary. But even a fragment of comfort, even a faint red ember in a pan of ash, can mean the difference between despair and survival. The brazier's glow fades, leaving you once more dependent on the dwindling hearth outside. The wind rattles, shudders, and shakes the thatch, and you can almost hear the groan of bare branches in the forest beyond. Wood was the lifeblood of every fire, yet not everyone could gather it freely. You step outside into the brittle morning air and the struggle becomes clear. Firewood itself was a contested treasure. Records from memorial rolls and royal decrees confirm that access to forests was tightly controlled in much of medieval Europe. By the 12th century, slaves of woodland were claimed as hunting reserves for kings and lords. Cutting wood without permission could mean fines, beatings or worse. Peasants still scavenged fallen branches or gathered brush, but to drag home a heavy log was often to risk punishment. Fire, paradoxically, was both essential and forbidden. Here's one of those unexpected corners of history. People became adept at using every scrap, twigs, dried leaves, animal dung and even bundles of straw were burned when proper logs were scarce. In some regions, villagers gathered seaweed, dried it and piled it into smoky fuel heaps. Imagine the smell, acrid, salty, nothing like the clean crackle of oak, yet capable of keeping an ember alive for another night. Fuel was less about preference than about possibility. Historians are not united on just how severe the scarcity became during the Middle Ages. Some argue that woodland management was fairly sustainable in many regions, with lords planting new groves and regulating cutting to avoid disaster. Others insist that by the late medieval period, wood shortages were real and pressing, pushing communities toward alternative fuels like peat and coal. The evidence differs from region to region, but the debate underscores one truth: you could never take firewood for granted. You hoist an axe and test its weight. The thought of trudging into the Lord's forest fills you with both longing and fear. The trees stand silent, cloaked in frost, their trunks promising weeks of heat. If only you could claim them. But the penalty for poaching is steep. So you stoop instead, collecting fallen branches, brittle and light, hardly enough to stoke a meal. Children scatter through the underbrush, chasing twigs like treasure, their fingers red with cold, their bundles tied with string. At home, you watch the wood pile dwindle day by day. Each log burned is a calculation: should it be used now or saved for a night colder still? Families became experts in stretching supply, banking fires carefully, cooking quickly, layering clothing instead of logs. Sometimes the hearth was lit only for meals, and the rest of the day you endured the frost. Comfort was rationed like coin and every ember carried weight. The smell of smoke was not always pleasant. Westwood hissed and spat, filling the room with acrid fumes. Resinous pine popped and snapped, sending sparks across the floor. Oak burned slowly, steadily, and was coveted most. You feel the difference in every log, some too fast, some too smoky, some just right. Firewood became a vocabulary all its own, each type telling a story of survival. And yet you remember the bitter truth: many could not gather enough at all. Winter's a bit hardest for those too poor or too weak to haul branches. Neighbors sometimes shared. But scarcity bred suspicion too. A missing bundle might mean theft, a quarrel, even violence. Firewood, like bread, was survival currency. As dusk falls, you sit by the meager blaze watching it lick at the last log. Your hands ache from splitting, your back from carrying, but still the pile shrinks. You know, tomorrow you'll return to the hedges searching for more, hoping the Lord's reeve doesn't catch you straying too near the forest. The winter is long and the wood is always short, and so as the fire sputters and the shadows thicken, you realize that medieval warmth was never free. It was hunted, hoarded, and defended. Every flame had a cost and every log was a victory carved out of scarcity. The woodpile dwindles and soon there is nothing left but twigs, bark, scraps, and a few stubborn lumps of animal dung. You sigh, rubbing numb hands together and glance toward the marshland beyond the village. That's where another kind of fuel waits, one you wouldn't call elegant, but one that has saved countless winters. Peat and turf. Written sources from Ireland, Scotland, and parts of northern Europe leave little doubt that people cut blocks of peat from bogs, dried them and stacked them like bricks for burning. Archaeologists still find traces of these practices in the ridges carved into peat lands, evidence of centuries of harvesting. Peat didn't blaze like wood, it smoldered, slow, smoky and pungent. But in a world where wood was scarce or too tightly controlled by lords, peat was survival, dug straight out of the ground. An odd detail often surfaces in local records: families treated their peat stacks with almost ceremonial care. The blocks were cut in spring, laid out to dry in long rows, then gathered and piled carefully against a wall or fence. To lose your peat pile to thieves or floods was a disaster equal to losing your winter food. Some households even locked them in sheds, guarding the bog bricks as if they were treasure. Not all researchers agree on how effective peat truly was. Some argue it produced more smoke than heat, filling cottages with a thick tarry haze that coated everything in black film. Others insist that, once properly dried, it provided steady, long-lasting warmth, perfect for slow cooking and overnight fires. The truth may depend on how well each community prepared it and whether damp weather left the block soggy and useless. You picture yourself now in the bog, boot soles sinking into soft earth, the smell of wet moss heavy in the air. You swing a special spade slicing neat rectangular blocks from the ground, each squelching as it lifts free. Your back aches quickly, but you keep cutting, stacking the bricks on the bank to dry. The work is filthy, but each block feels like future life, each row like a promise that your hearth won't go dark at home. You feed one of the bricks into the fire. It doesn't roar its size. A slow, smoky glow spreads outward, the smell earthy, almost sweet, curling into your clothes until you wear the bog on your skin. You cough at first, but then you smile faintly. The heat is gentler than wood, steadier. It won't warm the whole room, but it will keep the embers alive while you sleep, sparing you the dread of waking to a dead here. Half neighbors glance at your stack with envy, asking how much you cut this year, whether you'll trade a few bricks for bread or wool. You hesitate, knowing your own pile must last. Still, a few find their way to friends, because survival here is never just individual. It's shared. One night you may save them, another night they may save you. The fire smolders deep into the night, peat bricks glowing red like buried jewels. The smoke stings your eyes, blackens the rafters and makes your throat scratchy, but you endure it. You know that outside the frost sharpens, snow thickens, and winds scrape across the land. Inside, at least, your hearth breathes, fed by the earth itself. You lie down on your straw pallet, pulling the blanket tighter. The room smells of bog and smoke, not pleasant, but strangely comforting. It is the smell of continuity, of fuel that doesn't run out as quickly as wood, and you realize that peat, humble and messy, has turned your fragile cottage into a pocket of stubborn survival. When dawn comes, pale and cold, the embers are still alive. You poke them gently, coaxing flame from the peat's lingering heart, and you whisper thanks not to the forest, which the Lord forbade you, but to the bog, which gave freely if you were willing to stoop, cut and endure its muck. The bog's smoky gift still lingers in your clothes. When you hear another sound, distant, muffled, like carts creaking under heavy loads, you follow it toward the riverbank and there you see men, blackened with soot, unloading sacks and baskets. The smell hits you first, sharp, acrid. Unlike wood or peat, this is coal, the fuel that will one day remake the world. But here in the Middle Ages it is still a curiosity creeping slowly into daily life. Records from Durham, Newcastle and along English rivers show that by the 13th century sea coal was already being hauled by boat and cart to nearby towns. It burned hotter than wood, lasting longer, and merchants quickly saw its value. Yet for most villages it remained an oddity, dirty, foul, smelling and unfamiliar. Some lords purchased it for castles, especially in areas close to mines, but further inland many peasants had never seen a lump. And here's a curious little wrinkle: early on, people were suspicious of coal smoke. Chroniclers describe Londoners complaining that it fouled the air, blackened walls and sickened the lungs. There are even accounts of noble women avoiding houses where coal fires burned, claiming the smoke ruined their clothing. Despite these protests, the fuel spread, because when forests thinned and wood prices rose, coal offered something essential: consistency. You could dig it, haul it and stack it in heaps that outlasted any pile of logs. Scholars remain divided on just how widespread coal use became during the medieval period. Some argue it was limited mostly to mining regions and large towns, where transport made it practical. Others suggest that by the late 14th century, coal was already reshaping urban life, powering industries like smiting and brewing, in addition to warming hearths. The truth is tangled in patchy evidence, charred fragments in archaeological digs, city ordinances grumbling about smoke, scattered household accounts. Still, its creeping presence is undeniable. You squat near a coal heap picking up a lump. It stains your fingers instantly, leaving black smudges. The texture is rough, brittle at the edges, almost like a stone pretending to be wood. You sniff it, wrinkle your nose and toss it into a brazier. At first, it smolders without drama. Then suddenly it catches flaring with a fierce, steady heat. The room warms more quickly than you expect, though. The smoke curls thick and biting. You cough, waving your hand. But you can't deny the power in this little rock around you. People mutter opinions. One man swears he'll never burn the stuff, claiming it poisons his family. Another brags that his coal pile outlasts his neighbor's entire wood stack. Children watch wide-eyed as flames lick blue against the lumps, a strange color they've never seen from logs. A woman shakes her head at the mess, rubbing soot from her apron, but she doesn't stop feeding the brazier. Debate aside, the coal is hot, and hot means survival. The smell is harsh, clinging to your hair, seeping into your cloak. You imagine London a century later, its streets veiled in smoke, chimneys belching coal soot into every corner. Already, kings and councils were issuing complaints, trying to regulate its use. Yet demand only grew. People will tolerate a great deal when warmth is on the line. Night falls, and you sit by the brazier once more. The coal glows red, steady and strong, while the wind outside rattles the shutters. You rub your hands together, marveling at how much longer it lasts than wood or peat. You know it's dirtier, harsher, but you also know that many winters from now, villages and cities alike will depend on this black stone more than any log. Furthermore, you are watching not just a fire but a transformation, a new chapter in humanity's endless fight against the cold. And as your eyelids grow heavy, you realize that warmth in this world is never simple. Each fuel carries its price, wood with scarcity, peat with smoke, coal with soot. Yet all are embraced, because winter never negotiates, it only demands, and you answer with whatever will burn. The coal smolders steadily, but its acrid smoke makes you long for a different kind of warmth, one that smells of bread. You follow the faintest of scents down a muddy lane, and soon you arrive at the heart of every community, the kitchen, not just your own smoky hearth, but the larger spaces where food and fire came together in ways that often made them the warmest places anyone could find. Household accounts and medieval illustrations show clearly that kitchens were designed not just for cooking but also for concentrating heat. Large ovens were built of clay or stone, their domes glowing after hours of burning logs. Once the flames died down, the stored heat lingered, perfect for baking bread, roasting meat or drying damp clothes. In wealthy households, kitchens were deliberately placed apart from the main hall to reduce smoke and fire risk. But in winter these same rooms became coveted refuges, alive with the smell of roasted grain and bubbling pots. And here's one of those unexpected details: in many towns, communal ovens were built for villagers to share. Families brought their dough to the baker, who slid loaves into massive ovens that could bake dozens at once. People often lingered while they waited, crowding near the glowing mouths of the ovens just to feel their heat. Imagine the chatter, children fidgeting, neighbors exchanging gossip, all while basking in the radiant warmth that seeped into their bones. The bread was important, but the fire was irresistible. Historians remain divided on whether these kitchens and bakehouses truly served as social hubs or were simply practical necessities. Some argue they became informal gathering places in winter, drawing villages for both warmth and company. Others believe their role was more transactional, with little time spent loitering in the cold. The evidence is patchy, drawn from scattered accounts and local regulations about oven use. Yet when you step into one of these kitchens now, the debate hardly matters. The rush of heat against your frozen skin feels like proof enough. The kitchen itself is alive. Sparks leap from a hearth where a cauldron swings gently, its iron chain creaking with every stir. The oven mouth glows like sunrise, its clay arch hot enough to make you flinch when you lean too close. A servant pulls bread from within, the crusts blackening at the edges, the smell filling every inch with air. Another wipes sweat from his brow, despite the frost outside. For him, winter hardly exists here. The fire banishes it completely. You edge closer, letting the warmth soak into your stiff fingers. The floor is dusty with flour, the air heavy with smoke, but none of it matters. When your body finally thaws, you watch a boy toss kindling into the hearth, his movements practiced, his face ruddy with heat. He grins at you and you know he understands. This is the best room in the house, maybe the best room in the entire village when the snow lies thick on the fields. In poorer homes the kitchen hearth was smaller, but its role was the same. Families gathered around it not just to eat but to exist. Meals were slow cooked for hours, partly because it was efficient, partly because a simmering pot guaranteed the hearth stayed alive. Even scraps of vegetables or bones became fuel for warmth as much as for sustenance. The smell of cooking wasn't just hunger, it was reassurance that the fire had survived another day. Still, kitchens carried their dangers. Sparks leapt onto straw floors, grease fires flared and smoke often stung eyes until they watered. Regulations in medieval towns frequently mentioned fire risk in bakeries, warning of fines if ovens were left untended. Entire streets sometimes burned because one kitchen spark escaped into the night. Yet people accepted this risk. Without fire there was no warmth, no bread, no life. You lean back now against the kitchen wall, feeling the stone warm beneath your shoulders. The room hums with the rhythm of work, knives, chopping cauldrons, bubbling voices calling instructions over the crackle of flames. Outside, the frost still rules, but inside the kitchen the balance shifts for a few hours. This little chamber is a world unto itself, defined not by cold but by heat, not by silence but by sustenance. And as you close your eyes, breathing deeply of woods, smoke and fresh bread, you realize that kitchens were more than functional. They were havens, glowing pockets of life where community and comfort converged. If the hall showed wealth and the chamber showed intimacy, the kitchen showed survival. Fire transformed into food, warmth transformed into fellowship. The warmth of the kitchen clings to your clothes, but outside the wind bites again sharper. For the contrast. You shiver, clutching your cloak, and follow another trail of smoke, not from homes this time, but from places where work itself generated heat. In the heart of town you find the bakeries and breweries, their chimneys belching steam, their doors ajar as villagers slip inside to chase warmth, alongside bread and ale. City records and guild documents confirm that bakeries and breweries were not just economic centers but also accidental shelters. During winter, the ovens in bakeries ran day and night, especially in larger towns where communal loaves fed hundreds. Breweries, too, boiled mash and wort in great vats, filling the air with yeasty warmth that spread out into the street. For many villagers, lingering near these doors was an unspoken rite, a way to thaw hands and faces without asking permission. And here's a peculiar little scene preserved in a few chronicles: apprentices and children pressed their backs against the outer walls of bakeries because the heat of the oven seeped straight through the stone. Picture a row of villagers leaning like lizards against a sun-warmed rock, laughing at their own cleverness while the rest of the street froze. It wasn't elegant, but it was survival by proximity. Specialists continue to debate just how accessible these warm places really were. Some argue that bakeries strictly controlled their ovens, wary of fire hazards and outsiders meddling. Others counter that in crowded urban life it was inevitable that neighbors, beggars, and children hovered at the doors. The truth is probably in between, tolerated until it became disruptive, discouraged when fuel costs grew high. But for you, standing here now with the yeasty air wrapping your face, the scholarly quarrel is irrelevant. Warmth is warmth wherever it leaks. You push open the bakery door and are met with a wall of heat. The oven glows white-orange, its mouth a cave of fire, while men with long paddles slide loaves in and out. The air is thick with flour dust and smoke. Yet you feel your shoulders unclench immediately, your fingers thaw, your toes stop aching. The scent of baking bread seeps deep into your chest, intoxicating in its promise. Nearby women gossip as they wait for their dough, children chase each other among the benches and a stray dog curls beneath a table, too content to be chased out. You realize this place is more than a workplace, it's a magnet. People are drawn to its fire as moths are to light, not only for food but for relief. A short walk away, the brewery is just as inviting. Steam billows from great cauldrons where malted barley simmers, the air heavy with sweet, earthy fragrance. Workers stir with long poles, sweat shining on their brows, even as frost crusts the windows. You step inside, and the warmth envelopes you like a thick blanket. The sound of bubbling liquid, the hiss of steam, the clatter of mugs being filled, it all merges into a symphony of comfort. Of course, dangers lurked here too. Fires burned constantly, fuel was consumed at staggering rates, and accidents with boiling liquid could be deadly. Regulations in some towns specifically mention breweries as fire hazards, requiring inspections or taxes to offset the risk. But none of that stops people from slipping into the steamy air, breathing deeply, as if warmth itself could be swallowed. You linger watching the brewer lift a mug and sip his cheeks. Flushed workers laugh despite their labor, their bodies too warm to care about the winter, pressing at the doors for a fleeting moment. You feel envy. What must it be like to spend every day surrounded by this heat, even if it comes with sweat and risk? By the time you leave, your clothes carry the smell of bread and beer mingling with smoke. Outside, the frost is still waiting, but you feel fortified, as though you've stolen a portion of the bakery's fire and the brewery's steam to carry with you. These places weren't meant to be refugees, yet they became them, industries, doubling as hearths for entire communities. And as you walk home, the cold closing in again, you realize that warmth often came not from private fires but from shared labor. To hover near ovens and vats was to borrow the heat of work itself to let survival sneak in alongside the making of daily bread and ale. The smell of yeast and smoke still clings to you as night closes in. You retreat from the street, your breath clouding in the frigid air, and enter a small chamber lit by a single lamp. There, resting on a table, lies another invention for keeping life in your fingertips, a hand warmer, the intimate cousin of the brazier household. Records and finds from archaeological digs tell us that portable hand warmers, small metal containers filled with glowing coals, were carried by the well-to-do in colder months. They were crafted from brass, bronze or iron, often with pierced lids to let the heat escape in controlled measure. Some were simple, others ornamented with delicate cutworm designs that cast faint patterns of light when the embers glowed within. They could be slipped inside a sleeve, tucked into a cloak or carried like a lantern of warmth through bitter streets. And here's one of those delightful oddities. In Italy and Spain, these devices were sometimes disguised as hollowed-out spheres, almost like oversized apples that you could cradle discreetly in your palms. Women used them at church, concealing the glow under shows while kneeling on icy stone floors. Imagine a congregation murmuring prayers, piety etched on every face, while under the folds of wool, tiny coal-filled orbs kept fingers from stiffening into claws. There is debate among historians about how widely accessible such warmers were. Some argue they were rare luxuries restricted to nobles, merchants and clergy who could afford the metal work and steady supply of charcoal. Others suggest that simpler versions, perhaps clay pots with holes or crude iron cups, were common enough in towns, especially where winters were harsh. The truth is likely a spectrum, with ornate warmers gleaming in aristocratic halls and humbler cousins glowing quietly in villages. You lift one now. Its surface warm against your palms. The metal radiates steadily, not scorching but persistent, like the comfort of holding a small animal. You tuck it into your sleeve and the warmth creeps up your arm, easing joints stiff from cold. You feel a strange intimacy with this device. It is not a blazing hearth that fills a room, but a companion. You carry with you, a secret ember against the world's indifference. The air smells faintly metallic as the charcoal burns. You hear the occasional pop of an ember shifting inside, a reminder that even this tiny comfort is borrowed from fire's unpredictable nature. Children eye it, curiously, tempted to hold it but warned of burns. You remember the stories of clumsy servants dropping one into straw or cloth, igniting disasters from what was meant to soothe. Every ember in the Middle Ages carried both salvation and danger, even in something so small. Yet you cannot deny its usefulness. As you step outside into the night, the warmer tucked close, you feel shielded against the bite of wind. Your cloak flaps, your cheeks sting, but your hands remain alive, blood flowing freely instead of seizing in numbness. The device allows you to walk further, work longer and endure more than you could barehanded in winter markets. You notice merchants huddling with their own warmers, lifting the lids now and then to stir the embers. A scribe in the corner warms his fingers before returning to parchment. A woman selling woolen caps leans over hers like it is a confidant, muttering to herself as the crowd presses by. Each warmer is personal, private, a portable half carried into the coldest corners of daily life. And when you finally return home you slip it beside your pallet, the glow fading slowly as you drift to sleep. It does not heat the whole room, but it keeps your world just bearable enough. That is the truth of medieval warmth, not grand comfort, but little victories, scattered like embers, each one enough to push back the frost for another hour. The little hand warmer fades to ash, and you stretch your stiff shoulders realizing that even with clever tools, the cold presses on the body itself becomes the last fortress. You tug your cloak tighter and notice how every villager, every monk, every noble combats the winter in layers, building warmth not from walls or fires alone, but from clothing that becomes a kind of armor. Contemporary records and archaeological textiles confirm that wool was the backbone of medieval winter wear. Peasants wrapped themselves in coarse, undyed wool, while the wealthy draped in finer cloth, often dyed with expensive pigments. Wool was prized because it held heat even when damp. A blessing in a season where snow melted on your shoulders and sleet soaked your hems beneath. People wore linen shifts and shirts, the fabric smooth against the skin, layered thickly when weather grew cruel. And here's one of those fascinating quirks: in the colder regions of Europe, garments were sometimes stuffed with raw fleece or even scraps of fabric to create quilted padding. In effect, early medieval folk stumbled upon a version of insulation we'd recognize today. Some outfits were so bulky they restricted movement, but when frostbitten wind howled, nobody cared how graceful you looked. There are even illustrations showing children bundled to the point of absurdity, little more than eyes peeking out of cocooned layers. Researchers disagree on just how much fur was worn by everyday people. Some argue it was reserved for nobles who flaunted man, sable and fox as symbols of prestige. Others insist that villagers too had access to humble furs, sheepskin, rabbit or goat lining, boots and cloaks with scraps, even if they lacked the elegance of aristocratic pelts. What is certain is that fur, whether rich or ragged, was invaluable for keeping winter out of the bones. You pull on a cloak now. It's wool, rough but reliable. A hood shadows your face, cutting the sting of wind. Beneath, a linen tunic itches against your skin, and you've wrapped rags around your feet in makeshift socks before slipping into leather shoes stiff with frost. The layers make you clumsy, but you're grateful. Each piece is another wall between you and the season that waits to gnaw at your marrow. In noble halls, the scene is more extravagant. Ladies sweep past in gowns lined with fur, their sleeves trailing like banners, while men wear padded doublets beneath embroidered sar coats. The garments are dazzling, but they also serve practical needs. A thick fur collar shields a throat. A long woolen cloak traps heat when drawn tightly across the chest. Even fashion, bent to the demands of winter, though, wealth allowed style to masquerade as necessity. The smell of landline clings to you, earthy and faintly sour. It's the scent of wool that has never been fully washed, free of grease, a smell familiar to every medieval nose. Your cloak grows heavier, with snowflakes dampening slowly, but it still holds its heat. You notice others shaking out their garments, muttering at the weight but smiling grimly because without these layers they'd already be frozen. Children chase each other in the street, their laughter sharp in the air. Their cloaks flap wildly, their mittens patched, their boots wrapped in cloth. They don't complain. They've known no other winter than this. You see them gather near a brazier, cloaks steaming faintly as the frost melts away, the smell of wet wool filling the air, and when you return home, you hang your cloak near the fire, watching it smoke gently as it dries. Tomorrow it will be stiff again, ready to protect you once more. You realize, then, that survival here is not just fire or food. It is the fabric on your back, the layers wrapped around your body, the animal skins and woven cloth that become as necessary as breath. For in this world, clothes are not ornaments but shields. Each tunic, each fur lining, each rag-wrapped boot is a line of defense in the war against winter. And without them, no hearth, no brazier, no peat brick could save you for long. Your cloak still smolders faintly by the fire, its wool drying from melted snow, but even dressed in layers, you can't help noticing how much the season dictates your rhythm. In the medieval world, winter wasn't just a chill in the air. It rewrote the very shape of daily life. Chronicles and seasonal calendars make it clear that work and leisure bent to the cold months. Agricultural labor slowed when the ground froze. Solid plowing halted, fields lay dormant and only livestock demanded steady care. Short days meant long nights, with most households rising late and retreating early, their waking hours bound tightly to the flicker of firelight. The pace of life itself grew sluggish, as if people hibernated in human form. And there's a curious twist in these seasonal patterns. Because labor slowed, winter became a time for indoor crafts and communal gatherings. Women spun wool or flax by the hearth, men repaired tools, children helped twist rushes into lights. Storytelling flourished on long nights, songs and riddles filling smoky halls. In many villages, the freezing season was, paradoxically, when culture deepened, when you learned to sing, carve or play games simply to outlast the darkness. Specialists disagree on whether medieval winters were truly harder on the body or merely different in rhythm. Some argue that reduced labor saved strength, balancing the hardship of cold. Others point out that scarcity of food and fuel made the season more punishing, shortening lifespans. The truth may lie in the unevenness of it all. Some households feasted and rested, others starved and shivered, depending on harvests, lords and luck. You picture yourself now at the hearth in late afternoon. The sky outside is already dim and supper is bubbling in a single pot. Everyone eats earlier, not just because darkness comes fast, but because there is nothing else to do. Once the rush lights gutter low, the evening stretches endlessly, you wrap a blanket around your shoulders and settle in for tales told in hushed voices. A neighbor shares news from another village, a child recites a rhyme, someone hums a tune older than memory. Festivals to punctuate the season, Yuletide feasts or carnival brought moments of riotous joy into the otherwise heavy rhythm. Families saved their best wood for these nights, letting the fire blaze brighter, cooking extra meat, inviting warmth into hearts as much as into bones. For a fleeting night, cold was forgotten, replaced by dancing shadows and the smell of roasting fat. And still the season shaped sleep itself. People often went to bed soon after dark, waking again in the middle of the night for a first sleep, then lying awake or chatting quietly, before drifting into a second sleep until dawn. This segmented rhythm fit the winter better. When hours of darkness stretched too long for unbroken rest. You imagine yourself waking in the middle of the night, feeding the hearth, whispering to a companion, then curling back under the covers until morning. The air smells of wool and smoke, heavy and familiar. You stretch your feet toward the fire, sighing as the warmth soothes your toes. You realize that winter is not just endured but patterned, its demands woven into work, rest, food and prayer. Life bends to the cold because it must. As the night deepens, you hear the distant howl of wind against shutters, the snort of livestock shifting in the shed. Yet inside, wrapped in the rhythm of winter days, you feel strangely content. The world has slowed, narrowed, but in that narrowing lies a kind of focus. Survival is not frantic but deliberate, every act measured, every ember watched, and as you drift toward sleep you understand that medieval winters were not simply months of suffering. They were months of adaptation, of finding meaning in slowness and of shaping community against the backdrop of frost. The rhythm of winter days is heavy, but sometimes the season itself surprises. You imagine stepping outside one morning to find not misery but marvel, a river frozen, solid its surface, hard as glass, stretching wide beneath a pale sky. Word spreads quickly and by afternoon the banks are crowded. Merchants, children and travelers tread boldly onto the ice. A frost fair has begun, a rare celebration when winter itself becomes a stage. Chroniclers in England describe these fairs vividly during the later Middle Ages, especially on the river temples when cold spells locked it in ice. Stalls sprang up almost overnight, built from timber and cloth, selling food, drink and trinkets. Bonfires burned on the frozen surface, smoke curling into the crisp air. While people laughed at the absurdity of living atop what should be water for a season defined by scarcity, these fairs were bursts of abundance and joy. One detail that feels almost comic: vendors sometimes roasted meat or brewed ale right there on the ice. Imagine the courage setting fire at top frozen water, trusting the thickness of the frost to hold. Reports described the ground trembling with cracks, yet the rivalry continued, people choosing ferment over fear. Children skated clumsily on bones strapped to their shoes, dogs bounded wildly and jugglers performed while bundled in wool against the bitter air. Not all scholars agree on how widespread or frequent these festivals were. Some argue they were rare anomalies limited to unusually harsh winters during the so-called Little Ice Age. Others suggest that smaller local versions occurred more often than we realize, their traces lost because they were informal and temporary. The debate lingers in fragmentary accounts, but whether occasional or common, the memory of a frost fair captures something essential: the human refusal to let winter win entirely. You step onto the ice now, the surface creaking faintly underfoot. The air rings with laughter and shouts, the smell of roasted chestnuts mingling with the sharper tang of smoke. A fiddler plays a tune while couples dance carefully, their cloaks spinning as their breath clouds around them. For once, no one seems worried about the cold. It has become part of the spectacle, a shared joke between villagers and season. Children rush past, cheeks flushed, holding sticks tipped with ribbons. Merchants hawk gingerbread shaped into animals, their voices booming across the frozen expanse. Somewhere a man slides mugs of ale across a table, froth sloshing as the drink threatens to freeze. Dogs bark, geese honk indignantly at their frozen pond, and everyone presses closer to the flames built on the ice, marveling that they can exist at all. The joy is contagious. You find yourself grinning, despite your stiff fingers, despite the numbness creeping into your toes. For a few hours, winter feels less like an enemy and more like a conspirator in a grand game. Even the danger's creaking ice, sudden cracks only add to the thrill. People cheer when a loud snap echoes across the river, then laugh nervously, adjusting their steps but refusing to retreat. As twilight falls, the fair grows more, magical torches flicker, their reflections glowing on the icy surface, the air hums with song, mugs clink and shadows dance across makeshift stalls. You breathe deeply, the cold filling your lungs, but instead of dread you feel exhilaration. Winter has given you a gift, an unexpected festival carved from frost itself. When at last you leave, trudging back to your smoky cottage, your body is weary but your spirit strangely light. You know the cold will know again tomorrow, that hunger and smoke will return. But tonight you carry the memory of laughter on ice. In the long war with winter, moments like these are victories, fleeting, fragile but unforgettable. The memory of laughter on the frozen river fades as night draws in again. You sit by the embers, the world quiet outside, and you realize that for many, warmth was never only physical. People turned to stories, charms and whispered protections, believing that unseen forces could shield them from the bite of the cold. Winter, after all, wasn't just an enemy of the body, it was a test of spirit. Parish records and folklore collections reveal that charms against the chill were woven into everyday life. Families muttered prayers over the hearth, invoking saints to keep the flames alive. Saint Blue, Saint Lawrence, or even Saint Bridge were called upon, their names stitched into chants meant to keep embers glowing. Crosses of straw were hung over doors in parts of Ireland, thought to bless the house against frost. These practices were less about changing the weather and more about reassuring the soul that one wasn't fighting the cold alone. And here's one of those curious threads in the fabric of superstition. Some households believed that throwing a pinch of salt into the fire would chase away not only evil spirits but also the cold itself. In German villages, people sprinkled ale into the hearth as an offering, a small sacrifice, to keep warmth steady. Imagine crouching by the fire, muttering as you toss a crumb of bread or a splash of drink into the flames, bargaining with the unseen to let your family survive another night. Scholars still debate how literally such beliefs were held. Some argue they were symbolic, a way of layering meaning onto routine chores like banking the fire. Others insist that people genuinely feared supernatural cold spirits of winter, witches who could steal the hearth fire or demons that rode the north wind. Folklore blurs the line between faith and practice, and it may never be clear whether these rituals were earnest or simply habit passed down through generations. You watch now as a villager whispers over the hearth, tracing a cross in the air with fingers. Children look on wide-eyed, clutching each other as sparks leap up. A charm is spoken softly, not shouted, because magic is always more powerful when it sounds like a secret for a moment. Everyone believes the fire has grown stronger, the room a little warmer. You feel it too, though reason tells you it's only the cold catching at last. Legends swirl in taverns and on winter roads. Tales of travelers lost to snowstorms who survived because a saint appeared with a lantern of eternal flame. Stories of witches who blew frost through keyholes, stealing warmth from sleeping families. Old men swear they've seen frost sprites tapping at shutters, their nails sharp as icicles. These tales make children squeal and adults smile wryly. But they also reveal the truth. When survival is fragile, imagination becomes another tool. You lean back listening to a neighbor recount a tale of a miraculous fire that never went out, guarded by a kindly spirit in the marsh. Everyone nods solemnly, as if the story itself carries warmth. The flicker of flame seems brighter, the smoke less harsh. For a brief while, belief itself feels like insulation, wrapping the heart in something stronger than wool. The night deepens, wind clawing at the shutters, but inside the room is hushed, spellbound. A child yawns, curling close to her mother, soot smudged on her cheek. Someone stirs the fire and embers leap, showering sparks like stars. No one says it aloud, but everyone is grateful for the charm that lingers in the air, whether from salt prayer or simple storytelling. You close your eyes, the words of blessing still echoing faintly, and you realize that medieval warmth was never just logs and embers. It was also belief woven into prayers, charms and legends. When the cold pressed hardest, people reached not only for fuel but for faith, for magic, for the hope that something unseen might stand with them against the frost. The stories of charms and spirits linger in your ears as you wake the next morning to a different sound, the sharp sniffles and ragged coughs of those around you. Winter didn't just freeze bodies, it unsettled minds. Physicians of the medieval world were convinced that cold air itself carried dangers far beyond discomfort. Medical treatises from the period, especially those influenced by Gaelic theory, stressed that the four humors of the body blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile could be thrown into chaos by exposure to chill, cold and damp. Physicians warned, encouraged phlegm to dominate, leading to coughs, fevers and melancholy. The body, like the hearth, was seen as a furnace. If the flame inside grew too weak, imbalance followed. And here's a peculiar practice born from this belief: people sometimes carried sachets of herbs, sage, rosemary, lavender, pressed close to their noses, hoping their warm, dry scents would counteract the dangerous influence of cold, damp air. In Italy, physicians prescribed cloves or nutmeg to be chewed. Tiny sparks of inner fire meant to keep humors balanced. Imagine shivering in the wind while biting down on a pungent clove, convinced it would keep both frost and illness at bay. Scholars remain divided over whether these practices were rooted more in theory or habit. Some argue that physicians sincerely believed in cold air as a vector of imbalance, while others suggest many recommendations were symbolic, a way of comforting patients with rituals that provided psychological warmth. The lack of precise records leaves the question open, though the persistence of these remedies hints at how strongly people trusted them. You sit by the hearth now listening to a neighbor describe his cough. He insists it began when he walked in the night wind without a cloak, and everyone nods knowingly. Another recounts a child who let the frost into her chest, and remedies are exchanged freely: garlic boiled in milk, wine mulled with spices, even sitting close to a brazier while wrapped tightly in blankets. The cures are as much about heat as about medicine. The smell of spiced wine fills the room as someone prepares a remedy, cloves and cinnamon simmering until the air grows fragrant. You take a sip and it burns pleasantly, heat spreading from your tongue down into your chest. You feel almost convinced the cold itself is being driven away, replaced by the fire of spices. Whether it's medicine or just comfort, you don't care, it works, at least for now. At monasteries, infirmaries echo with similar sounds: monks coughing in their CS, the scent of rosemary smoldering in bowls, physicians lecturing on the dangers of north winds that bring not just chill but disease. Herbal remedies are measured and administered with enmity. But beneath the ritual lies the same truth you feel at home: heat is health, cold is peril. The fear of melancholy, too, seeps into conversation. People whisper that the long darkness brings sadness. That is more than mood, it is a humor imbalance, the body flooded with black bile. To sit too long by a dying fire, they say, is to let melancholy take hold. You realize that in winter even your spirit is considered vulnerable, your mood as fragile as your breath. You watch a woman toss herbs into the hearth, muttering as the smoke rises. She breathes it in, deeply convinced the fragrance will guard her family. The children imitate her, holding sprigs to their noses, giggling at the sharp scent. The ritual binds them together, belief as much as medicine, warmth woven from both fire and faith. And as the night settles again, you lie beneath blankets, chest still glowing faintly from spiced wine. You realize that warmth in this world is more than firewood, peat or coal. It is also the conviction that heat inside, whether from food, drink or spirit, protects against the dangers of winter. In a time when science and superstition mingled freely, the line between health and warmth was blurred, and perhaps that was its own kind of cure. The spiced wine's glow lingers in your chest, but your eyes drift across the room and take in the house itself. You realize that warmth wasn't only a matter of fire or clothing. It was built into the very bones of medieval homes, shaped by architecture that tried, in its own uneven way, to keep the cold at bay. Archaeological studies of surviving manors and cottages reveal that medieval builders knew the cold intimately. They thickened walls with layers of stone or earth, designed low ceilings to trap heat and built small doorways that let in less of the biting wind. Even the placement of houses within villages sometimes served the fight against frost, dwellings clustered close together, roofs angled to shield one another, like neighbors huddling for protection. What seems to us quaint or cramped was in fact a strategy: every timber, every joint, every curve built with survival in mind. And here's one of those intriguing quirks: some cottages had smoke hoods or canopies built above the open hearth, funneling smoke upward. Without the sophistication of a full chimney, these early contraptions weren't elegant, but they directed smoke just enough to make sitting near the fire tolerable. Imagine crouching under a rough wooden canopy while flames snapped beneath the hood, capturing most of the haze, so your eyes didn't burn with every breath. Researchers continue to argue about how much these designs truly insulated. Some believe that stone walls, though thick, stored cold as easily as they stored heat, making interiors little warmer than outside air. Others suggest that the combination of walls, low ceilings, and fabric hangings created enough of a buffer to make survival significantly easier. The truth is probably mixed. The same wall that radiated warmth after hours of fire could just as easily leach heat overnight if not carefully tended. You step into a cottage now ducking under the doorway. The ceiling is low enough that you nearly brush it with your head, and immediately the space feels snug. Compressed, as though the room itself is trying to hug its inhabitants. The walls are rough, but the thickness muffles some of the outside wind. You notice how the hearth is set into the central floor, smoke guided into the rafters, blackening beams but leaving enough air below for people to live. Every detail whispers of compromise. Nothing perfect, everything practical. In larger homes, architecture showed the same tension. Castles with their massive stone walls looked invincible from the outside, but inside they trapped cold like caverns. Lords fought this by building smaller chambers within, layering them with tapestries and narrowing windows to mere slits. Kitchens were often tucked near the great hall, so the heat of ovens could seep into surrounding rooms. Spiral staircases, hugged fireplaces carrying warmth upward through otherwise frigid towers, these details didn't erase the cold, but they bent it, softened it, wrestled it into something survivable. The smells tell their own story. Damp stone carries an earthy tang. Wooden beams exude the sharpness of smoke soaked deep into their grain. Rush mats on the floor smell faintly of mold and herbs replaced each season to freshen the air. Even the ceilings have their own perfume, soot, tar, and the memory of countless fires. You realize that warmth wasn't only something you felt, it was something you could smell, a signature of a house that had endured many winters. Outside, you notice how the whole village seems arranged for endurance. Houses cluster tight, barns and byres pressed close so animals. Warmth contributes to human survival. Narrow lanes block wind and fences of woven brush catch drifting snow. Architecture wasn't just walls, it was choreography, an entire layout meant to keep frost from ruling unchallenged. Of course, not every design worked flawlessly. Roofs leaked, shutters rattled, smoke hoods failed and cold seeped through every seam. Fire hazards lurked in every thatch and one stray ember could undo a generation's work in minutes. Yet people kept building, repairing, adapting. Survival wasn't about perfection. It was about persistence. At night, lying under low rafters, you notice how different the space feels compared to a noble hall. Here, the ceiling presses down gently, holding in what little heat the hearth provides. The room smells of wool drying, of stew simmering, of smoke hanging thick. But you are grateful. It is warmer here than outside, and in winter that difference matters more than grandeur. Somewhere in the village a hammer rings faintly as someone repairs a shutter, determined to seal a draft before the next storm. In another house, fresh dung is plastered into a wall crack, its earthy smell accepted as the price of warmth. Architecture here is no beauty for beauty's sake. It is survival in timber and clay, stone and smoke, each house, a handmade shield against the season. And as you close your eyes beneath those dark beams, you understand that warmth wasn't found only in fires or fabrics. It was baked into the design of the very spaces people lived in, the quiet ingenuity of builders who shaped walls and ceilings into weapons against the winter. Imperfect, smoky, fragile, but enough, always, just enough. The thick walls of the cottage fade from memory as you picture a different setting, the looming silhouette of a castle, its towers cutting into the gray sky. From a distance it looks impregnable, a fortress against every threat, but step inside during the depths of January and the illusion crumbles. The stone does not repel the cold, it magnifies it. Even lords, for all their power, could not escape the winter's bite. Castle inventories and surviving architectural features tell us the same story. Though vast fires roared in the great halls, most of the chambers remained frigid. Thick walls, sometimes 10 feet across, stored chill as well as they stored heat, and drafty arrows slits let icy air creep through. The lords and ladies of these strongholds layered themselves in fur and wool draping cloaks, even while indoors servants scored endlessly with bundles of logs, feeding fireplaces that burned with more spectacle than efficiency. And here's an odd, telling detail: castle latrines, known as garter robes, often doubled as makeshift wardrobes. Why? Because clothes stored near them absorbed the constant draft of cold, which supposedly deterred moths from chewing holes in the fabric. Imagine stepping into a stone shaft chamber on a winter morning, shivering, while changing garments, telling yourself, "At least the moths are gone." Even in grandeur, compromises were constant. Historians remain divided over how much comfort castles truly offered. Some argue that with multiple hearths, thick hangings and carefully placed chambers, nobles lived relatively warm compared to peasants. Others counter that even kings complained of icy drafts and that tapestries and blazers did little more than soften misery. The truth likely lies somewhere between. Lords had more layers of defense against cold, but they never conquered it entirely. You walk now into the great hall of such a fortress. A fire blazes at the far end in a grand fireplace, tall as a man, its carved stone mantel blackened by years of smoke. Sparks leap, flames roar. And yet when you step away from its circle of heat, your breath immediately clouds the air. The opposite wall is rimmed with frost. Its stones slick with condensation. Servants cluster close to the fire, pretending to polish goblets, while in truth they are shoring their hands. Upstairs, the chambers are colder still. A noble woman sits near a small brazier, her gown lined with fur, hands tucked into a muff. She laughs with her ladies, but her cheeks are flushed, not from comfort but from the chill. Behind her, the walls are hung with richly woven tapestries, knights and saints depicted in bright thread. They serve as decoration, yes, but also as insulation against the relentless cold radiating from the stones. The smell of burning wood follows you everywhere, oaks and beeches carted in by the wagon load, consumed in endless hunger by fireplaces that never rest. Servants mutter about the pace of cutting and hauling, knowing that even a lord's forest might dwindle quickly in a harsh winter. In some accounts, entire villages were tasked with keeping castle hearths supplied, their own fires shrinking while the fortress blazed. Night falls, and you wander the corridors, the torches sputter, their flames bending in the draft. You clutch your cloak, tighter footsteps echoing against walls that feel more like a tomb than a home. In a distant chamber you hear a child crying from the cold, a nurse muttering comforts as she tucks another blanket around. The little body power cannot erase winter. It only buys a few more layers, a few more logs, a few more servants to feed the flames. Still, there is a strange majesty in this endurance. Castles stood not only as defenses against invaders but as monuments to human stubbornness against nature. Their stones loomed through centuries of frost, housing people who endured by layering fabrics, hanging tapestries, feeding blazers and telling themselves that strength resided in these walls, even if their toes were numb and their breaths visible. They believed the fortress stood as proof that survival was possible. You sit, finally, in a small chamber, a single candle burning weakly, and pull your cloak closer. The fire in the great hall is too far to reach now, and the brazier here has gone out. The stone presses in on all sides, indifferent and cold. Yet you find yourself smiling, wryly. If even lords and kings shivered through the night, then perhaps there is comfort in the shared truth. Winter humbled everyone, no matter their title, and so you lie down on a stiff mattress, breath misting, the walls groaning with the weight of frost. The castle may tower over fields and rivers, but tonight, within its bones, you feel no different from the peasant in his dung-plastered cottage. In the face of winter, power bends, pride freezes and every ember matters. The castle's echoing chill lingers in your bones. But as dawn creeps over the village, you hear something else, voices, close and warm, rising in laughter despite the frost. Step into the cluster of cottages and you'll see why. When the nights grew harshest, when even firewood dwindled and embers dimmed, neighbors turned not only to their hearths but to one another. Memorial records and oral traditions remind us that winter was rarely endured alone. Families shared fuel, borrowed embers, and sometimes even split meals when scarcity pressed hardest. A hearth wasn't just private property. It was a resource woven into the social fabric of the community. People survived less because of thick walls and more because of shared warmth, literal and figurative. There's a striking little custom preserved in scattered village accounts. When a household's fire died, a child was sent to a neighbor's cottage carrying a covered pot or clay jar to fetch a living coal. The errand wasn't seen as shameful, it was expected. A flame passed from one hearth to another was like a lifeline, a thread binding homes together. Imagine trudging through snow, clutching a pot wrapped in wool, guarding a single glowing ember as if it were treasure. Scholars still argue about how far this solidarity stretched. Some suggest it was universal, the instinct of villages everywhere to share fuel and stories when survival was at stake. Others point to evidence of theft, quarrels and accusations when wood piles or peat stacks went missing, suggesting that desperation sometimes outweighed community spirit. Both can be true, of course. Winter could inspire generosity on one night and suspicion the next. Survival was never purely noble. You watch now as neighbors gather around a brazier. In the center of a cottage, a woman pours thin ale into mugs, steam rising faintly while children press close to the glow. The air is thick with smoke, chatter, and the unmistakable smell of damp wool drying. Jokes fly, complaints are shared, and someone tells a story from years past when the snow lay so deep that roofs collapsed under its weight. The laughter that follows feels warmer than the fire itself. The sounds of the gathering blur into comfort: mugs, clinking, dogs barking softly under the table, a baby fussing until soothed by her mother's hum. You realize that what heats the room isn't just fire, but fellowship. The cold outside may be relentless, but within these four walls people manufacture their own season, one of chatter, companionship, and fragile security. In poorer villages, solidarity was sometimes more dramatic. Entire families might sleep in a single cottage during the harshest spells, pooling blankets, livestock and fuel. The space grew unbearably crowded, but bodies pressed together made the difference between shivering and freezing. To live through winter was to surrender privacy. To accept that survival demanded closeness. You picture yourself now leaning in as an elder shares a folktale, his voice rasping like the crackle of the fire. Children gasp and giggle at the tale's twists, while adults nod knowingly at its lessons. The story becomes another ember, carried from voice to ear, passed along like flame in the darkness. By the end, you are not just warmer, you are steadier, more certain you'll endure. Yet there were moments of tension too, when food grew scarce and fuel dwindled. Neighbors watched one another carefully. A missing log might spark suspicion, a vanished peat brick an argument. The same closeness that bred solidarity could breed resentment. Winter tested not only the body but also the bonds between people. Still, more often than not, you find laughter louder than quarrels. The knowledge that others endured the same frost, the same smoke-filled rooms, the same coughs and stiff joints. This made the burden lighter. Misery shared was misery carved. As the evening stretches on, someone sings softly a lullaby, more than a song, the notes curling like smoke toward the rafters. Conversation dwindles, mugs, empty blankets are drawn tighter, the fire sinks low, but hearts remain a little warmer for the time spent together. You walk home through the snow, your own breath misting in the dark, and you carry with you more than heat. You carry the certainty that in the medieval winter, survival wasn't an individual achievement, it was communal. A patchwork quilt sewn from countless small kindnesses, an ember given, a story shared, a place at the fire offered when the night was long. By the time you crawl back into your straw bed, the lesson lingers. Winter pressed hard, but human warmth, messy, noisy, generous, pressed back, and that, more than wood or peat, kept the frost from winning. The echoes of neighborly laughter trail off as you climb the rise toward the parish church. Its tower looms against the pale sky. Bells, silent doors closed against the wind. Yet as you push them open you feel something unusual, not warmth exactly, but a gentler cold. The church, built of stone like a castle, should be an icy cavern. Instead, the air seems softer, tempered by centuries of ritual and human presence. Church records and architectural surveys tell us that many medieval churches were not heated in the modern sense. Fires were often forbidden in sanctuaries for fear of smoke and damage, and the vast stone naves remained cold as the grave worshippers shivered through long masses, cloaks wrapped tight, breath fogging in the air. Yet churches had their own ways of pushing back the winter. Thick walls trapped not just sound but also the faint warmth of crowded bodies, and small side chapels or vestries sometimes kept blazers discreetly tucked away. Here's a curious practice recorded in several regions. Parishioners sometimes brought small hand warmers or even hot stones wrapped in cloth to services, hiding them under cloaks while they prayed. Wealthier congregants might even hire a servant to hold a brazier nearby, shielding their master from the worst drafts. Imagine rows of villagers kneeling on stone floors, each secretly clutching a warm rock. Faith mingling with the most practical of comforts. Historians debate whether large cathedrals were simply endured as icy monuments or whether more creative heating solutions were quietly employed. Some evidence suggests that during major feasts, great torches and piles of candles were lit in such numbers that the combined heat raised the temperature noticeably. Others argue this was wishful thinking, that no amount of wax could soften the chill of such vast spaces. Standing here now, the cold pressing into your bones, you suspect both views are partly true. Enough candles to glow like stars, not enough to thaw your feet. You shuffle toward a side chapel where a brazier smolders faintly. The smell of incense mixes with the acrid tang of charcoal, creating a haze both holy and earthly. A monk tends the coals, adding a few chips of resin that pop and release fragrant smoke. You extend your hands discreetly, letting the warmth brush your fingertips around you. Worshippers murmur prayers, their voices soft but steady, weaving a rhythm that distracts from the cold. The architecture itself plays tricks on perception. Sunlight through stained glass splashes color across the floor and the brilliance makes the space feel warmer, though the air is still sharp. The reds and golds trick the eye into believing the body is less chilled, a medieval psychology of warmth built into the very walls. You notice villagers clustered in pews, cloaks overlapping, children nestled against parents sharing body heat, while the priest intones. The organ wheezes faintly, its pipe stiff with frost, but the music rises like breath, filling the nave with sound even in the bitter cold. The ritual itself provides a kind of insulation, repetition, community belief. For an hour you forget the drafts that creep through cracks, the stone that leaches. Heat festivals made the church warmer still, not by fire but by sheer numbers. On Christmas Eve or Mundalas, hundreds crowded shoulder their collective heat, shifting the balance. The air grew thick, pungent with sweat and wool and incense. It wasn't comfortable, but it was survivable, and in that closeness people felt a strange joy. The church became not just a place of worship but a place where winter itself seemed less hostile. Its bite dulled by bodies and song. Outside, the bells toll their sound, carrying through crisp air. You pull your cloak tight as you step back into the snow, but something lingers. The church did not truly warm you, but it steadied you. Its walls offered shelter from wind, its rituals meaning into cold days, and its community made frost feel less lonely. Later you think of the countless winters when villages trudged here, boots crunching, snow faces roar from wind drawn not just by faith but by the promise of togetherness. The fire may not have blazed, but the spirit did, and in the end that was its own form of heat. As night falls, you sit by your own hearth again, remembering the glow of candles, the murmur of chants, the faint touch of warmth in the side chapel. You realize that survival in this world was not measured only in logs and embers. Sometimes it was measured in voices raised together in colored light, in the stubborn faith that the cold could not conquer the soul. The memory of colored glass and incense still lingers when you step away from the church into the silence of deep winter night. The stars glint overhead, cold and merciless, and the ground crunches with every step. You realize that across villages, towns, monasteries and castles, people have fought the same enemy in endless variations. But here, as the journey draws toward its end, you begin to see the pattern. Survival was always a patchwork quilt stitched together from fire, fabric, faith and fellowship. Contemporary chronicles and archaeological remains confirm that no single method was enough. Hearths smoked but gave light. Blazers warmed but threatened suffocation. Tapestries softened stone but never banished drafts. Coal burned hot but fouled the air. Peat smoldered steadily but left houses choking in tarry haze. Every choice carried its price, and yet people balanced them daily, trading smoke for warmth, risk for comfort, scarcity for endurance. And here's a striking image preserved in folklore and fragments of diaries. People sometimes spoke of winter as a living creature, a wolf pressing at the door or a giant crouching on the roof. They described the fire as a loyal guardian, an ember-fed sentry holding the beast at bay. To bank the coals each night was to arm that guardian, to give it strength enough to fight until dawn. Imagine leaning over your hearth, whispering encouragement into the embers, as though the flame could hear and obey. Scholars continue to wrestle with just how harsh medieval winters truly were. Some argue that climate shifts, like the Little Ice Age, exaggerated the suffering, making the 15th and 16th centuries cruel than earlier times. Others insist that endurance was always relative. A peasant in the 11th century shivered just as fiercely as one in the 14th, regardless of recorded temperatures. The debate may never be settled, but the reality remains clear: cold was an unchanging fact and survival demanded unending ingenuity. You sit now by the hearth one final time, your hands outstretched to its glow. Around you all the images of the past weeks rise together: the peasant cottage patched with dung, smoke stinging the eyes. The noble hall roaring with spectacle, yet leaving backs icy. The monastery cloister, silent and punishing where cold itself was prayer. The bathhouse steaming with relief, laughter echoing through mist. The frost fair on the river, children skating on bones, fires burning miraculously at top ice. The neighbors, gift of embers carried carefully in a pot across the snow. The charm whispered over flames, the herbs ache pressed to the nose, the spiced wine burning its way down to the chest. Each fragment alone is fragile. Together they weave a tapestry of survival, the story of how humans met the deepest cold, not with comfort but with courage. You think of the countless unnamed men, women and children who endured drafty nights, who woke stiff and coughing but still rose to cut wood, fetch peat or tend animals. You see their breath in the frosty air, their cloaks stiff with snow, their laughter ringing through smoky rooms. They did not defeat winter, but they endured it, and that endurance itself became triumph. The room grows quieter as the fire sinks low. You lie back on straw, the heavy weight of wool pressing against your shoulders, the scent of smoke curling into your hair. Your body is tired, but your heart is steady. For now, the ember in the hearth still glows, its faint red pulse, a reminder that even in the darkest season, warmth can be coaxed into being. You let your eyes close and the world narrows to the crackle of ash, the murmur of distant wind, the rhythm of your own breath. Medieval winters were harsh, unrelenting, but they also shaped resilience, inventiveness and a stubborn refusal to give in. Every ember, every story, every shared blanket was proof that people could carve out life against the coldest odds. And so you drift into sleep, surrounded by centuries of survival, carried on a tide of smoke and shadow. Winter waits outside, but here within you are warm enough to dream. And now, as the story closes, the fire itself seems to soften. The crackle grows gentler, the glow dims to a faint red and the room fills with a hush that feels like comfort. You breathe deeply, slowly, letting your shoulders loosen, your body sink into the imagined weight of blankets. The long journey through medieval winters has been tiring, hasn't it? You've trudged through smoke, film cottages, drafty castles, steaming bathos and frost fairs, on frozen rivers. You've sat with peasants and lords alike, shared warmth with monks, merchants, and neighbors, and through it all you've discovered that warmth was never just about fire. It was about persistence, about finding small victories against the cold, about never letting the ember die. Let your mind wander back over those images one more time, the child carrying an ember in a clay pot, the smell of peat smoke curling into a cottage, the shimmer of tapestries glowing in firelight, the sound of laughter echoing across ice. Each one is a thread woven together into a quilt of memory. And as you lie here now, you can wrap yourself in that quilt, knowing that humanity has always found a way to endure. The cold outside your own window may be real, or perhaps it is only an imagination. Either way, you are safe here at this moment. You are sheltered by walls, by words, by centuries of stories that remind you survival is never solitary. People have always huddled close, whispered charms, shared coals and spun tales in the darkness, and you listening now are part of that same chain. So let your breath grow slower, your thoughts lighter. The fire is low, the night is kind, and you can drift at last into warmth deeper than any hearth. Sleep well and dream softly.